There is a moment that people who have been betrayed by someone they love tend to remember with a precision that ordinary memory does not usually achieve. Not the confrontation, not the argument, not the dramatic scene that the narrative version of betrayal always moves toward. The moment they remember most clearly is the one just before, the moment when they knew, fully and completely and without any remaining possibility of doubt, and had not yet decided what to do with knowing. That moment has a specific quality. The world does not stop. The sounds of the house continue around you. Somewhere a door opens, or a clock ticks, or a voice carries through a wall, and you are standing inside your own life with a piece of knowledge that has just permanently changed the shape of everything, and the change has not yet announced itself to anyone else, and for one suspended moment you are the only person alive who understands that nothing will ever be quite the same again. Diana had that moment. She was in her 20s, married less than 2 years, and she picked up a telephone extension in a room in Kensington Palace and heard her husband's voice speaking to another woman in a register she had never heard him use with her. Not the public voice, not the formal voice, not even the occasional warmth he showed in their better private moments. Something else. Something lower and more private and completely unguarded, the voice of a man who believed he was speaking only to the person he most wanted to speak to in the world. The woman on the other end of the line was Camilla Parker Bowles. Diana did not say anything. She did not announce herself. She did not interrupt the conversation or slam the phone down or confront Charles when he came off the call. She listened for long enough to understand what she was hearing, and then she placed the receiver down quietly, and she carried the knowledge of what she had heard into the rest of her marriage like a stone she had been handed and could not put down. She never confronted him about it. Not directly, not in the way the word confrontation implies, the named accusation, the demand for explanation, the forced acknowledgement between two people that a truth has been spoken and cannot be unspoken. The absence of that confrontation is the central fact of the marriage more than anything that was said or done. The not saying shaped everything. It shaped how the marriage functioned and how it failed and what it cost Diana and what it revealed about Charles and what the palace did with both of them. It shaped ultimately the story that the world received, not the true story which lived in Diana's silence, but the managed version, which the palace constructed in the space that her silence provided. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Understanding why she didn't confront him requires understanding who she was when she heard it and where she was and what the world around her looked like from inside. She was 21 years old. She had been in the institution for less than 2 years. She had married a man she barely knew in a ceremony watched by 1 billion people, and had moved into a palace in which the staff reported to the institution rather than to her, and in which the rules of how things were done had been established long before she arrived and would continue long after she left. She was alone in a specific way that is difficult to describe to anyone who has not experienced it. Not friendless, not without family. Alone in the sense of having no one around her who was not in some way connected to the institution she had married into, and whose loyalty, when it came to a conflict between her interests and the institution's interests, would go where it had always gone. Confronting Charles would have required certainty about what she had heard, and confidence that the hearing was real and not the product of the anxiety that the palace would later use to explain everything she reported about her marriage. It would have required someone to confront him to, someone whose response she could trust, someone who was hers rather than the institution's. She had no one like that. Not yet. So she carried the stone, and the weight of carrying it, across the years that followed, across the pregnancies and the public duties and the deteriorating private reality and the managed image of a happy family, shaped her into the person who would eventually find her own way of making the stone visible without ever putting it down. What follows is the story of what she heard, and what she knew, and what she did with knowing, and what it cost her, and what it cost everyone around her, and what it ultimately revealed about the institution that had required her silence as the price of her place within it. The phone call was not the beginning of the story, but it was the moment when Diana understood, with the specific clarity of direct experience, that the story she had been told about her marriage was not the story she was actually living. Everything after that moment was shaped by the gap between those two stories. That gap is what this is about. The engagement announcement photograph was taken in November 1981 in the grounds of Buckingham Palace, and it has been reproduced so many times across so many decades that it has acquired the quality of an icon rather than a document. Diana in a blue suit, the sapphire ring on her finger, leaning slightly into Charles in the way that people lean into people they are comfortable with. Charles with his hand at her waist, smiling the smile of a man who has completed a task that has been on his list for some time. The photograph was staged in the way that all official photographs are staged, but the staging was skillful enough that it read as spontaneous. Two people in the first warmth of a new thing, caught by a camera at a moment of genuine happiness. The gap between that photograph and the reality of what had been agreed to in the weeks before it was taken is one of the most documented gaps in the history of the modern monarchy. It has been described in books and documentaries and testimonies picked over by biographers and journalists and the principals themselves. The documentation is extensive enough that the basic facts are not seriously disputed. Charles did not want to marry Diana. He wanted to marry Camilla Parker Bowles, and he had wanted to marry her for the better part of a decade, and he had not done so for reasons that were institutional rather than personal. Camilla had not been considered suitable, and then Camilla had married someone else, and then Charles had continued the relationship with Camilla after her marriage in the way that a certain kind of man continues the relationships he considers primary, regardless of the formal arrangements that surround them. By the time the palace began applying serious pressure on Charles to produce an heir and the wife that producing an heir required, Camilla was married to Andrew Parker Bowles and unavailable in any formal sense. What she was available for, and what she and Charles had established between them across years of intermittent but sustained connection, was something more durable than formal availability, a private understanding between two people who had decided that their connection was more important than the arrangements around it. Charles understood what marrying Diana would mean for that understanding. He understood it, and he married Diana anyway because the institution required it, and because Charles, whatever his private failures, has always understood the institution's requirements with the clarity of someone who was raised from birth to serve them. The marriage to Diana was a duty. The relationship with Camilla was the reality. Charles had arranged his life in the manner of a certain kind of English aristocratic man to contain both things simultaneously in separate compartments, and he expected those compartments to remain separate. They did not remain separate. They could not remain separate, because the person Charles had married was not the kind of person who could be kept in a compartment. Diana was not a society woman with her own life and her own discrete arrangements who would understand and maintain the architecture of a formal marriage that served institutional purposes, while the real emotional life happened elsewhere. She was a 20-year-old who had grown up reading romantic novels, and who had understood the engagement and the wedding and the ring as the beginning of something real. The mismatch between what Charles thought he was entering into and what Diana thought she was entering into was fundamental and was visible to people who knew both of them from the beginning. The people who saw it and said nothing, who observed the mismatch and understood its implications and did not intervene, bear a portion of the responsibility for what followed that history has not always fully assigned them. The palace knew, not every individual within the institution, but the people whose job it was to know. The senior advisors, the private secretaries, the courtiers who had been managing the royal family's affairs for decades and who understood Charles's attachment to Camilla and its probable implications for any marriage he entered. They knew, and they calculated that the institutional requirement for an heir outweighed the personal consequences of a marriage built on a fundamental deception, and they proceeded. This calculation was not new. The history of royal marriages is substantially a history of this calculation: institution first, individual second, and the individuals who suffer the consequences managed as efficiently as possible to minimize the damage to the institutional image. The calculation had been made for generations. It was made again for Charles and Diana, and it produced the same result it had always produced. The institutional requirement was met, and the individuals paid the cost. Diana paid considerably more of the cost than Charles did. This is partly because of the specific nature of what happened in the marriage, and partly because of the specific nature of who Diana was, and partly because of the institutional response to Diana when she began to show the cost visibly. But before any of that, Before the bulimia and the depression and the self-harm and the managed cruelty of the palace apparatus, there was simply the marriage itself, in its early years, and the growing understanding on Diana's part that the version of it she had been sold did not correspond to the version she was living. The early years are important because they establish the pattern. The pattern was not dramatic. It did not begin with explosive revelations or confronted deceptions. It began with something quieter and in some ways more corrosive, the slow accumulation of small evidence that something was wrong, each piece individually deniable, collectively impossible to ignore. The phone calls were part of it from early on. Charles was not discreet in the way that a man conducting a relationship he intended to keep secret needs to be discreet. He was discreet in the way that a man conducting a relationship he considered his private right tends to be, careless enough that the people around him, the people who were paying attention, encountered evidence of it regularly. The staff knew, the senior advisors knew, the friends who moved in the same circles knew. Diana began to know through exactly the mechanisms you would expect, through the quality of Charles's absences, through phone calls that ended when she entered a room, through the specific register of distance that a person maintains when they are emotionally located somewhere other than the room they are physically occupying. She asked questions in those early years. The questions were not confrontations. They were the ordinary questions of a young wife trying to understand the shape of her marriage, where he was going, who he had been speaking to, why the warmth that was sometimes present had disappeared again. The questions were met with responses that were technically not lies but that were designed to foreclose further inquiry. Charles was not cruel about it, not initially. He was simply unreachable in a specific way, the way a person is unreachable when the thing you are trying to reach them about is the thing they have decided you are not entitled to reach them about. Diana's isolation in those early years is the context for everything that followed. The staff at Kensington Palace were loyal to the institution. Her ladies-in-waiting were selected through palace channels and owed their positions to the institution's approval. Her family was physically distant and emotionally limited in their ability to understand what she was experiencing. Her mother had her own difficult marriage history. Her father was unwell. Her sister had her own life. The friends she had before the marriage had been filtered through the proximity problem. Nearness to Diana meant nearness to the palace, and nearness to the palace changed relationships in ways that could not be undone. She was 21, and 22, and 23, and she was in one of the most famous marriages in the world, and she was more alone than she had ever been in her life. The phone call happened in this context, not as a single dramatic event dropped into an otherwise normal marriage, but as one particularly clear piece of evidence arriving in the middle of an accumulation of evidence. What made it different from the other evidence was its directness. The previous knowing had been inferential, the reading of absences and distances and small evasions that could each be individually explained away. The phone call was direct. It was Charles's voice in the specific register of intimacy, speaking to a specific woman, in terms that left no room for the inferential gap that had allowed Diana to maintain a degree of uncertainty about what she was dealing with. Uncertainty has a protective function. As long as you are not fully certain, you have not been fully deceived. The possibility remains that you have misread something, that the explanation you have not yet received will resolve the unease. The phone call removed that possibility. It closed the inferential gap. It replaced uncertainty with knowledge. Knowledge is heavier. Knowledge requires a response, or the conscious decision not to respond, which is its own response and carries its own weight. Diana chose not to respond. The reasons for that choice are the subject of Part 4 of this account, which deals specifically with the silent strategy and what it was and where it came from. But the choice itself, made in the moment of hearing and sustained across the years that followed, began here, in the specific quality of what Diana understood when she placed the receiver back down and stood in whatever room she was in, and understood that the marriage she thought she had entered was not the marriage she was actually inside. The institution had given her a role. The role required a marriage. The marriage was a performance of something that did not in its private reality exist in the form the performance described. She was 20-something years old, and she was standing inside that understanding, and she was completely alone with it. The stone had been placed in her hands. She would carry it for the rest of her life. In the way she moved through her public duties and the way she managed her private grief and the way she eventually found, through oblique and careful channels, her own methods of making the weight visible without ever setting it down in the direct confrontation that the knowledge seemed to demand. The marriage that was never what it seemed had produced in its first years a woman who was learning a specific and terrible skill, the skill of knowing something completely and acting as if she did not, in a world that required her silence as the price of everything she had been told she was gaining. It is not a skill that comes without cost. The cost was already beginning, in those early years, to be visible in the ways that costs always become visible when they are not acknowledged. In the body, in the health, in the quality of presence that a person brings to a life they are spending enormous energy pretending is something other than what it is. The palace would later describe what was happening to Diana in those years in the vocabulary of mental illness: unstable, difficult, demanding. The vocabulary served the institution's purposes. It explained Diana's behavior without engaging with its causes, and it positioned the institution as the victim of an unpredictable woman rather than the architect of an impossible situation. The behavior that the vocabulary pathologized was the behavior of a young woman carrying a stone she had never agreed to carry, in a house that had handed it to her, and then explained that carrying it was simply what women in her position did. The house was wrong. Diana was not built for that kind of carrying, which was not a weakness. It was in the end the thing that made her the most consequential member of the family she had married into, in ways the institution never intended and never fully recovered from. But that is later in the story. In the beginning there was only the phone call, and the silence that followed it, and the young woman standing alone with what she knew. To understand what Diana heard on that phone call, you have to understand what Camilla Parker Bowles was to Charles before Diana existed in his life at all. The popular version of the Charles and Camilla story tends to begin with Diana, with the love triangle, the unhappy marriage, the parallel relationship conducted in the shadow of a public performance of domestic normality. That version is emotionally coherent and dramatically satisfying, and it places Diana at the center of the story, which is where public sympathy has always located her. But Camilla was not a consequence of the marriage to Diana. She was prior to it. She was, in the most accurate reading of the available evidence, the central relationship of Charles's adult emotional life, and the marriage to Diana was the thing that happened around that relationship rather than the other way around. Getting this sequence right matters, because it changes the nature of what Diana walked into. She did not marry a man who later strayed. She married a man who had never in any meaningful sense left. Charles met Camilla Shand in 1971, at a polo match, through the social circuitry of the upper-class English world they both inhabited. She was 24, he was 22. The connection was immediate in the way that connections between people who speak the same language, the same social language, the same set of references and codes and assumptions, tend to be immediate. They recognized each other, not just personally but categorically. She was someone he did not have to perform for. That last quality is more significant than it sounds in the context of Charles's life. Charles had been performing since birth. The heir to the throne exists, from the moment of that designation, inside a permanent audience, every interaction observed, every expression calibrated, every relationship assessed for its institutional implications. The performance is not dishonest exactly, it is simply what the life requires. But it produces, in the person required to maintain it, an acute hunger for the spaces where the performance is not required, for the person in front of whom you can simply be whoever you actually are, without calculation or management. Camilla was that person for Charles. From the beginning and continuously afterward, she was the relationship where the performance stopped, where he was not the Prince of Wales but simply a man, with a man's ordinary desires and humors and vulnerabilities, speaking to someone who responded to those things directly rather than through the institutional filter that surrounded every other relationship in his life. This kind of connection, once established, does not dissolve easily. It does not dissolve when circumstances change or when time passes or when other relationships are formed around it. It persists because it answers something fundamental, a need that exists prior to circumstance and that circumstances cannot fully address. The circumstances changed quickly. By 1973, Camilla had married Andrew Parker Bowles, a cavalry officer whose own social world overlapped with Charles's, and whose attitude toward his wife's connection with the Prince of Wales appears, from the available evidence, to have been one of pragmatic acceptance rather than opposition. The Parker-Bowles marriage was not by any account a love match in the conventional sense. It was an arrangement of the kind that the social world both parties inhabited understood and accommodated. Two people with compatible backgrounds and mutual convenience, living lives that had significant independent components. The marriage did not end Charles's relationship with Camilla. It changed its form, the particular architecture of that social world, where discretion was valued above almost everything, where private arrangements between consenting adults were considered entirely separate from the formal structures of marriage and public life, where the code of silence around such arrangements was maintained with a thoroughness that made the arrangements sustainable over very long periods, provided the framework within which Charles and Camilla continued. They continued across the 1970s, with intermissions imposed by Charles's naval service and the geographical distances his public duties required. The intermissions did not produce the kind of emotional distance that sustained separation tends to produce between people whose connection is primarily circumstantial. They produced the opposite, a correspondence, a maintenance of contact through letters and occasional meetings, a quality of sustained attention that is more characteristic of a primary relationship than of an affair. This is the crucial distinction that the popular telling of the story tends to flatten. An affair is a secondary thing, something conducted alongside a primary relationship, drawing from it and dependent on it for its specific emotional charge. What Charles and Camilla had was not structured as a secondary thing. It had the emotional architecture of a primary relationship that happened, for institutional reasons, to lack the formal designation. Charles's other relationships during this period, the ones that the press tracked with the prurient enthusiasm of an earlier tabloid era, were the secondary things. The various women he was photographed with and rumored to be involved with and occasionally genuinely involved with, those were the affairs in the technical sense. Camilla was not. Camilla was the thing those other relationships were secondary to. The palace understood this at some level. The people who managed Charles's affairs in the administrative sense were aware of the Camilla connection and of its persistence and of its implications for any marriage Charles might eventually contract. The awareness did not produce intervention. It produced the calculation that has been described already. The institutional requirement for an heir would be met. The marriage would be contracted with a suitable candidate, and the management of what that marriage contained would be handled as management questions were always handled. The suitability criteria that the palace applied to candidates for Charles's wife were, in retrospect, revealing. The woman needed to be young enough to be reliably fertile. She needed to be from the right social background. She needed to have no significant romantic history that could generate tabloid interest or institutional embarrassment. She needed to be in the specific vocabulary of that world, biddable, amenable to the requirements of the role, unlikely to resist the institutional pressures that the role imposed. Diana Spencer met every criterion. She was 19 when the relationship began in earnest, practically without prior romantic history, from an aristocratic family with long-standing royal connections, and possessed of a sweetness and apparent pliability that the palace read as the right raw material for the role. What the palace's criteria did not include was any assessment of Diana as a person, of her emotional intelligence, her perceptiveness, her capacity for deep feeling, her fundamental refusal, at the level of character, to be the kind of person who could sustain an indefinite performance of something she knew to be false. Those qualities were not irrelevant to the role. They were, in the event, the most relevant things about her, but they were not on the checklist. Camilla was aware of Diana from the beginning. The social world was small enough that she would have tracked the development of Charles's relationship with the young Spencer girl, with the attention of someone with a significant personal interest in its outcome. What Camilla thought about Diana, what she felt about the approaching marriage, is not fully in the public record. What is in the public record from Diana's own account is a meeting between the two women shortly before the engagement was announced. Diana described the meeting in the recording she made for Andrew Morton's book, the recording that was itself an act of controlled disclosure, the most carefully managed version of speaking that Diana had yet attempted. The meeting with Camilla was at a dinner party at a mutual friend's house. Camilla, by Diana's account, said something that lodged permanently in Diana's memory. She said something to the effect that Charles was going to be very busy, that Diana should not expect him to be available in the way a new wife might expect. The specific words were not threatening. The subtext was unmistakable. Camilla was telling Diana, in the coded language of their shared social world, that the arrangement she was entering into had pre-existing terms, that Charles was not available in the way the engagement suggested, that the sapphire ring in the public ceremony and the 2 billion television viewers did not constitute an actual claim on the man Diana was marrying, because the man Diana was marrying was already, in the ways that mattered most, spoken for. Diana was 19 or 20 at this meeting. She understood at some level what was being communicated. She did not understand its full implications because the full implications are not comprehensible in the abstract. They only become comprehensible through experience, through the years of living inside the arrangement and feeling daily the specific weight of what Camila had been describing. The weight began to be felt almost immediately after the wedding. The honeymoon, which should have been the period of maximum intimacy between two people beginning a shared life, was described by Diana in her most unguarded accounts as already compromised. Charles had Camila's photograph with him. Charles read letters on the honeymoon that Diana believed were from Camila. Charles wore cufflinks that Diana later understood to have been a gift from Camila. The specific details matter less than what they collectively describe. A man on his honeymoon who was, emotionally, somewhere else. Diana noticed. She noticed, and she did not yet have the framework to fully process what she was noticing, because the framework requires acknowledgement of a thing that the person you are noticing it about has given you no direct reason to acknowledge. She had suspicions. She had the evidence of her own perception. She did not yet have the direct, unambiguous confirmation that the phone call would eventually provide. Camila, in those early years of the marriage, was not invisible. She was present in the social world that Charles moved through, at the events and gatherings and country weekends of the upper-class English life that continued around the formal structure of the Wales marriage. Diana encountered her. The encounters were managed by both women with the elaborate surface courtesy of their social world, in which the thing that everyone in the room understood was acknowledged by no one. The courtesy had a cost for Diana that it did not have for Camilla. Camilla knew what the arrangement was. She had constructed it, or at least consented to its construction, with full awareness of its terms. She was not operating in the dark. She was not carrying a stone handed to her by people who had not told her what they were placing in her hands. Diana was. The asymmetry of knowledge between the two women in those early years is one of the most important features of the situation and one of the least discussed. Camilla understood the marriage from the beginning. She understood what it was and what it was not, and what her position within it was. She was not surprised by anything that happened because she had been present for the decisions that produced what happened. Diana understood the marriage progressively, through experience, through the accumulation of evidence, through the specific clarity of a phone call that removed the last ambiguity. Two women, the same man, radically different relationships to the truth of the situation. The one who knew everything maintained her position for decades, moved through the public world with the composure of someone whose private standing was secure, and eventually achieved the formal recognition that the institution had long denied her. The one who learned progressively, who carried the accumulating weight of knowledge she had not sought and could not put down, died in a tunnel in Paris at 36 years old. The distance between those two outcomes is the distance between what the institution protects and what it consumes. It protects the arrangement. It consumes the person whose presence is required for the arrangement's maintenance and whose inconvenient humanity disrupts it. Camilla was the arrangement. Diana was the inconvenient humanity. The phone call, when it came, was the moment Diana understood this completely, not in these words, not with this analytical clarity, but in the immediate, bodily, irreversible way that direct experience produces understanding, the way that hearing your husband's voice speaking to another woman in the tones of genuine intimacy produces an understanding that no amount of inferential evidence had quite managed to produce before. She placed the receiver down. She stood in whatever room she was in. She understood. And Camilla Parker Bowles, on the other end of the line, continued speaking to a man who believed he was entirely alone with her, unaware that the woman whose marriage to him had been intended to resolve the institutional problem of succession had just heard enough to understand that the resolution was, and always had been, a fiction. The fiction would continue. Diana would continue to perform it, for reasons this account will examine, but the person performing it was changed, permanently, by what she had heard. You cannot unknow a thing. You can manage the knowing. You can refuse to act on it, or act on it obliquely, or carry it in silence for years while the world around you continues in its assumption that you do not know. But the stone is in your hands. It does not go back. The phone call did not happen once. This is the first thing to establish, because the singular version, the one dramatic moment of discovery, the lifted receiver, the overheard conversation, is cleaner than the reality and therefore more satisfying as a narrative, and therefore the version that tends to get told. The singular version places the knowledge at a specific point in time and allows everything before it to be innocence and everything after it to be consequence. The reality was messier and in some ways worse. There were multiple calls, multiple instances of Diana encountering through the ordinary domestic accident of a shared household, evidence of a conversation she was not meant to hear. The specific call that has been most documented, the one that Diana described in her most detailed accounts, the one that became the reference point in the Morton recordings and in the testimonies of people close to her, was not the first time she had heard something she was not supposed to hear. It was the time she heard enough that the accumulation reached its threshold and became impossible to continue absorbing as anything other than what it was. The household at Kensington Palace in those years was not the kind of place where privacy was easily maintained. Large houses with staff present at all hours, with the particular architecture of palace life that requires certain rooms to be accessible and certain routes through the building to be shared, do not lend themselves to the clean separation of private communications. Charles spoke to Camilla on the telephone. He spoke to her regularly. The calls happened at hours and in locations that reflected a man who had not fully accounted for the presence of a wife who was not where he expected her to be. Diana described the experience of encountering these calls in terms that conveyed the specific texture of the knowledge, not the dramatic revelation of a single moment, but the grinding, incremental accumulation of partial hearings, of conversations that ended when she came into a room, of the quality of alertness that a person develops when they have learned that certain sounds in a house carry specific meaning. She became, over the months and years of the early marriage, extremely sensitive to the register of Charles's telephone voice. She could tell, from a distance, from another room, from the particular quality of quiet that preceded certain calls, when she was hearing something she was not supposed to be hearing. The call that she described most specifically took place in the early years of the marriage, before the birth of William in 1982 by some accounts, after it by others. The exact timing is less important than the content and the context. Diana was somewhere in Kensington Palace, in a location that allowed her to access a telephone extension connected to the line Charles was using. Whether she picked it up deliberately, already suspecting what she might hear, or accidentally, in the ordinary domestic action of reaching for the phone to make a call of her own, is something the accounts vary on. What they do not vary on is what she heard. Charles's voice, speaking in a register she had never heard him use in her presence, lower than his public voice, more unguarded than anything she had access to in their private interactions. The voice of a man who was fully relaxed in a way that Charles, in Diana's company, was not fully relaxed. The specific ease of someone who has arrived at the place they most want to be and dropped every other preoccupation. And Camilla's voice in response. Not clearly, not fully. The extension and the distance and whatever acoustic conditions existed in that specific moment meant that Diana was hearing one side of a conversation more clearly than the other, but clearly enough. Clearly enough to hear the quality of exchange between them, the intimacy that was not performed but simply present, the way two people speak when the speaking is the thing they are there for rather than the vehicle for something else. The specific words that Diana reported hearing, in the various accounts she gave to the people she trusted over the years, varied in their detail. This is not evidence of fabrication. It is the normal behavior of memory under emotional stress. The specific words are less reliably retained than the overall impression, and the overall impression is what the memory returns to most consistently. What Diana consistently described was not a specific sentence or exchange, but a quality. The quality of two people speaking to each other in the private language of people who have been speaking to each other that way for a very long time. That quality was the thing that made the call different from the other evidence she had accumulated. The other evidence was circumstantial. This was direct. She was hearing in real time, not the inference of an intimate relationship, but the intimate relationship itself, conducted in the voices of two specific people she knew, in terms that left no room for the alternative explanation she had been perhaps still half constructing. She put the phone down. The accounts of what happened in the immediate aftermath vary in their specifics but agree in their general shape. Diana did not go directly to Charles. She did not announce what she had heard. She did not confront the moment with the kind of direct action that the moment seemed to demand. She went somewhere, to a room, to a part of the palace where she could be alone, and she absorbed it. She sat with it. She processed it in the way she had been processing things for months, in the interior space that she had been developing out of necessity, the private place where the things that could not be acknowledged publicly were kept. What she did with it in the days and weeks that followed was nothing. Externally, observably, nothing. She continued. She appeared at the engagements on her calendar. She sat across tables from Charles at dinners and stood beside him at public events, and maintained the performance of a marriage that she now knew, with complete certainty, was not what it had been presented as. The nothing is the part of the story that people find most difficult to understand. The question that gets asked most often, when people encounter Diana's account of this period, is why? Why did she not confront him? Why did she not demand an explanation? Why did she absorb the knowledge and continue the performance rather than forcing the acknowledgement that the knowledge seemed to make inevitable? The question is reasonable from the outside. From the inside, the reasons were multiple and interlocking, and each one was, in the context of Diana's actual situation, more rational than the confrontation would have been. The first reason was uncertainty about what confrontation would achieve. Charles had already demonstrated across the early years of the marriage a quality of unreachability on the subject of Camilla. The evasions and deflections and technical non-lies that had met Diana's earlier, softer inquiries had established that direct engagement with the subject produced nothing useful, not honesty, not explanation, not the acknowledgement that would have allowed Diana to understand the terms of the situation she was in. A confrontation based on an overheard phone call would produce, Diana had every reason to expect, more of the same, a denial or a minimization or a version of the conversation that reframed what she had heard in terms that she could not disprove. The confrontation would cost her the only advantage she had, the knowledge that she knew, which Charles did not yet know she had. The second reason was institutional. The palace by this point in the marriage had made itself known to Diana as a force that operated according to its own logic, independent of her personal interests. She had encountered the palace's management apparatus in small ways already, the handling of her public image, the management of her schedule, the particular quality of advice she received from courtiers that was always technically supportive and never quite on her side. She understood at some intuitive level that confronting Charles about Camilla would not remain a private matter between a husband and wife. It would become an institutional matter, and institutional matters were managed by the institution, and the institution's management of this particular matter would not prioritize Diana's interests. A confrontation would give the palace a problem to manage. The palace would manage it in the way it managed everything, by containing the disruption, restoring the surface, and ensuring that the image of the marriage continued to function. The management might involve sympathy for Diana, expressed through courtiers and advisors, designed to make her feel heard while ensuring that nothing actually changed. It might involve the particular form of institutional pressure that operates by making clear, without stating it explicitly, that the maintenance of the arrangement is not optional, and that the consequences of disrupting it fall primarily on the person who does the disrupting. Diana had been in the institution long enough to understand this. not with the full analytical clarity she would later develop, but with the instinctive understanding of someone who has spent enough time inside a system to know how it responds to pressure from within. The third reason was loneliness. This is the simplest and in some ways the most important. Confrontation requires a witness, not literally but structurally. It requires the support of someone who knows what you know and understands what is at stake and can be present for the aftermath. Diana had no one who occupied that role in her life in those years. The isolation of her situation had been established and maintained by the same institutional architecture that had produced the situation. She was alone with the knowledge, and confrontation from a position of complete isolation tends to produce outcomes that are worse for the person doing the confronting than the silence they were trying to end. She chose the silence. She chose it not because she was passive or because she lacked the courage that confrontation requires, but because the calculation was rational. The silence preserved the knowledge. It preserved her position. It gave her time to understand the full shape of the situation. Time to find the allies she did not yet have. Time to develop the resources, emotional, social, eventually public, that would eventually allow her to do something with what she knew that was more effective than a private confrontation that the palace would swallow and manage and render invisible. What she did with the knowledge, across the years that followed, was not nothing, it was everything. It shaped how she moved through the public role she had been assigned, and how she understood the institution she had married into, and how she eventually found her way to the people who could help her make the weight visible. But first she had to carry it. Alone, for longer than any person should have to carry something like that alone, in a house full of people whose job was to ensure that the surface remained smooth regardless of what was happening underneath it. The phone call was a Tuesday or a Thursday or a Saturday morning. It was sometime in the early 1980s when Diana was young enough and new enough to the institution that the full shape of what she had married into had not yet become completely clear to her. After it, the shape was clear. She did not say so. She did not act on it. She went about the business of being the Princess of Wales with the composure that the role required, in a performance that now had an entirely new dimension, not just the performance of a public role, but the performance of a woman who did not know what she knew. The performance was excellent. It was too good, in fact. The people around her, the courtiers and the staff and the occasional journalist who was given managed access, saw a young woman who was adapting to the demands of an extraordinary life with impressive grace. What they were seeing was someone who had developed, out of necessity, a facility for performance that would eventually become her most powerful public tool. She had learned it in the worst possible school. She had learned it by picking up a telephone and putting it down again and deciding, in the quiet that followed, that the knowledge would stay where it was for now. For now. That qualification is everything. Diana's silence was never intended to be permanent. It was a tactical choice made in conditions that did not yet allow for anything else. As the conditions changed, as she found allies, as she developed resources, as the isolation that had made silence the only rational option began to be reduced by the gradual accumulation of people she could trust, the calculation would change. The silence would break, not in the way Charles expected or the palace feared most in the immediate term, not in a confrontation, not in an explosion of private truth made suddenly public. It would break slowly, carefully, in channels that Diana chose with the deliberateness of someone who had spent years thinking about what she would do when the time came. The time was not yet. The phone call had happened. The knowledge existed. The stone was in her hands. She had decided what to do with it. For now, she would carry it. She carried it, and she walked back into the life the institution had built for her. And she smiled at the appropriate moments and stood in the appropriate photographs and said the appropriate things to the appropriate people. And no one who looked at her in those months and years could have told you that anything had changed. Something had changed. Everything had changed. The marriage that followed the phone call was the same marriage it had been before it, in every observable dimension. In the dimension that mattered, the dimension of what Diana knew and what she had decided to do with knowing. It was a completely different thing. She was playing a longer game than anyone around her understood. She had learned from the institution itself the value of patience, of maintaining the surface, of saying nothing until the moment when saying something would mean something. Charles had taught her that lesson. The palace had reinforced it. They would eventually understand, too late to manage its consequences, that they had taught it to entirely the wrong person. Silence is not one thing. The silence of someone who does not know is empty, a genuine absence of content, the quiet of a person moving through their life without the weight of specific knowledge pressing against the inside of their chest. The silence of someone who knows and has chosen not to speak is its opposite. Full, dense, actively maintained, requiring daily renewal of the decision that produced it. The first kind of silence costs nothing. The second kind costs everything, continuously, in the small daily expenditure of energy that maintaining it requires. Diana's silence after the phone call was the second kind. It was not passive. It was a practice, sustained across years, requiring the same kind of deliberate effort that any sustained performance requires. The effort of a person who gets up every morning and chooses again to continue doing the thing they have been doing, because the alternative still costs more than the continuation. The question of why she made that choice, why she sustained it, why the confrontation that the knowledge seemed to demand never happened in the direct form that the word implies, does not have a single answer. It has several, each one true in its own dimension, each one insufficient on its own. The combination of them producing something that looks from the outside like simple endurance but was, from the inside, an active and considered strategy. The word strategy sounds too cold for what Diana was doing. She was not operating from a position of calm, analytical detachment, mapping her options and selecting the optimal path. She was a young woman in a painful situation, making the best decisions available to her in conditions of significant constraint, and the decisions she made happened to have a strategic logic that she understood partly consciously and partly through the instinctive intelligence of someone who is very good at reading people and situations even when the reading is not comfortable. The first dimension of the silence was protection, specifically the protection of her sons. William was born in June 1982, about a year into the marriage. Harry followed in September 1984. The births changed Diana's calculation in ways that are not fully reducible to the conventional observation that children make people more cautious. They changed it because they changed what was at stake. Before the children, Diana's position in the institution was dependent on the marriage but was ultimately a matter of her own life and her own choices. After the children, her position was connected to theirs in ways that the institution understood very well and that Diana understood equally well. The Wales children were not ordinary children in any sense. They were constitutional assets, future king and spare, the continuation of the succession that the entire marriage had been contracted to produce. The institution's investment in them was total and permanent. Their mother's position relative to the institution, whether she was inside it or outside it, cooperative or disruptive, managed or unmanageable, would shape what kind of access she had to them and what kind of presence she could maintain in their lives. Diana understood this with the clarity of someone for whom it was not an abstract institutional principle, but a daily lived reality. The palace's management of the children, their schedules, their education, their public presentation, their relationship with the monarchy as an institution, was something Diana had to negotiate with an apparatus that held considerably more formal power than she did. Her leverage in those negotiations depended on her position within the institution. Her position within the institution depended, to a significant degree, on her continued performance as the Princess of Wales, which depended on the continued public functioning of the marriage. Confronting Charles, making the private knowledge public, forcing an acknowledgement that would inevitably become institutional, would have disrupted all of that. It would have moved the situation from a private difficulty being managed within the marriage to an institutional crisis being managed by the palace, and the palace's management of institutional crises did not historically prioritize the interests of the individuals inside them. Diana had seen enough of the palace's management style to know that an institutional crisis generated by her would be managed in ways that positioned her as the problem. The children were the weight on the silent side of the scale. As long as she could stay inside the institution, could maintain the performance, could continue to function as the Princess of Wales in public even as the private reality was what it was, she retained a degree of influence over their lives that confrontation and its consequences would reduce. The silence was, in part, a daily investment in staying close to William and Harry. The second dimension was epistemic. It is a word that sounds more technical than the reality it describes, which is simply this: Diana was not certain, in the way that certainty is required for a confrontation to function, that what she knew could be made to stand up in the specific kind of exchange a confrontation involves. She had heard a phone call. She had not recorded it. She had not witnessed anything that could be described to a third party as unambiguous evidence. She had the impression of intimacy, the register of a voice, the overall quality of an exchange, things that her own perception told her were conclusive, but that Charles, or the palace, or the courtiers whose job it was to manage exactly these situations, could reframe as the imagination of an unstable young woman who was, by the early 1980s, already showing the signs of the difficulties that would later be used to explain away everything she reported about her marriage. The bulimia had begun early in the marriage, before the wedding in fact, and the palace was aware of it. The depression had followed, the self-harm, the crises that were managed internally, kept from public knowledge, treated as the private health difficulties of a young woman under unusual pressure, rather than as the entirely comprehensible responses of a person who had been placed in an impossible situation and denied the resources to manage it. The palace's knowledge of these difficulties was not neutral information. It was a resource, a potential line of rebuttal available to the institution if Diana ever attempted to make her private knowledge public. Any confrontation Diana initiated, any attempt to name what she knew and demand that it be acknowledged, would be met with a counter-narrative that was already prepared and that had the advantage of being, in its limited way, factually accurate. Diana had mental health difficulties. Diana was struggling with the demands of her role. Diana's perception of her marriage was perhaps colored by those difficulties in ways that made her less reliable as a reporter of her own experience. This counter-narrative was not deployed against Diana in the early years in any sustained public way. It was kept in reserve, available for use if needed, which is sometimes more powerful than actual deployment. Diana knew it was there. She knew what the palace would say if she said what she knew. And she knew that in a contest between her word and the palace's word, conducted in the institutional context that the palace controlled, she would not win. The silence was also in part an acknowledgement of that power asymmetry. She was not positioned in the early years to make a confrontation work. The pieces were not in place, the allies were not available, the public standing that would eventually give her words a weight that the palace could not dismiss had not yet been built. She would need to build it before she could speak. The silence was, in this dimension, preparation, the patience of someone who understands that timing is everything and that the moment for speaking had not yet arrived. The third dimension of the silence was grief. This is the most human dimension, and the one that analysis tends to underweight, because grief does not have a strategic logic and therefore resists the kind of explanation that makes sense of things. Diana had loved Charles. Not with the full, clear-eyed love of someone who knows the person they are loving. She had not known him well enough for that, and the pace of the courtship and the pressure of the institutional context had not allowed for the kind of sustained ordinary intimacy from which real knowledge of another person develops. But she had loved the idea of him, the possibility of him, the version of him that the engagement and the wedding had seemed to make real. The phone call ended that love in the specific way that direct evidence ends things, not gradually, through the slow erosion of hope, but suddenly, in a single moment of complete clarity. What remained after the clarity was not hatred, it was grief. The grief of someone who has understood, suddenly and completely, that the thing they thought they had never existed in the form they thought it existed. Grief does not confront, grief absorbs. Grief requires time before it can become anything more active, and the time it requires is not something that the institution around Diana was configured to provide. The institution required her to continue, to appear, to perform, to be the Princess of Wales every day, regardless of what she was processing inside. She continued, she appeared, she performed, and the grief went where all the other unacknowledged things went. Into the interior space, the private room where Diana kept the things that could not be spoken, and where they accumulated across the years into a weight that eventually became impossible to continue carrying alone. The fourth dimension of the silence was, paradoxically, power. A confrontation gives the person being confronted the opportunity to respond, to explain, to reframe, to take the initiative of acknowledgement and use it to shape how the acknowledgement plays out. Charles, confronted directly with what Diana had heard, would have had the opportunity to manage the confrontation, to offer some version of explanation or minimization or deflection that, however inadequate, would have shifted the dynamic from Diana's knowledge to Charles's response to Diana's knowledge. The silence kept the knowledge entirely in Diana's possession. It gave her no resolution, no relief, no acknowledgement, but it also gave Charles no opportunity to manage it. He did not know she knew. He could not calibrate his behavior to the knowledge of her knowing, could not adjust the management of the situation in response to her having become aware of it. He continued in the assumption that the careful compartmentalization of his life was intact, and in that assumption he was vulnerable to her in a way he would not have been if the confrontation had happened and he had been given the chance to respond. Information that the other person does not know you have is power of a specific and durable kind. Diana held it for years. She held it in a marriage where almost every other form of power she might have exercised was limited or managed by the institution. The knowledge was hers. The decision about what to do with it was hers. The timing of any future use of it was hers. These were not small things in a life where very few things were hers alone. The silent strategy, taken as a whole, was the response of a person who was working with the resources available to her in conditions of significant constraint and making the best decisions those conditions allowed. It was not perfect. Nothing about Diana's situation permitted perfect decisions, but it was rational, and it was sustainable across a longer period than most people in her position would have sustained it, and it produced outcomes: the gradual building of public standing, the eventual finding of allies, the slow accumulation of the resources that would allow her to make the knowledge visible in her own time and on her own terms, that a direct early confrontation would probably not have produced. The cost of the strategy was enormous: the daily renewal of the choice to stay silent, the energy consumed by the maintenance of the performance, the specific damage of carrying the knowledge without ever being able to set it down in acknowledgement, damage that expressed itself in the body, in the health crises, in the bulimia and the depression and the self-harm that were the body's way of processing what the mind had been required to suppress. That cost is real and should not be minimized. The silence was not free. It was paid for daily in the currency of Diana's well-being, and the payment was extracted by an institution that was aware of the cost and factored it into its calculations as an acceptable loss, acceptable to the institution, not to Diana, not to the people who loved her, not eventually to the public that received her as a person rather than a role, and understood, through the slow disclosure of what her marriage had actually been, what the performance had required her to absorb. Charles continued to call Camilla. He continued to speak to her in the voice that Diana had heard on the extension, in the register that made the nature of the relationship unmistakable. He continued in the assumption that his compartmentalization was intact, that the architecture of his life was holding, that the marriage was performing its institutional function while the real emotional life happened alongside it, in the separation he had always believed was sustainable. He was wrong about the separation. He was wrong about the architecture. He was wrong, most consequentially, about what Diana knew and when she had known it and what she had decided to do with knowing. The woman he believed was performing the role of his wife without full awareness of what the role contained was, in fact, performing it with complete awareness, for reasons he had not been given the opportunity to understand, in a strategy whose endpoint he could not have predicted from the position of not knowing it was being executed. Diana was playing a game Charles did not know was being played. The rules were the rules of the institution: patience, surface, maintenance of appearances, the long view over the short one. The institution had taught her those rules by requiring her to live inside them. She had learned them more thoroughly than the institution intended. What she was learning, across those years of silence, was how to wait, how to build, how to position herself, incrementally and without announcement, for the moment when waiting would give way to something else. That moment was not yet. The silence continued. The stone stayed in her hands. She carried it into the next year, and the next, and the year after that, in the corridors of Kensington Palace and the formal rooms of Buckingham Palace and the public spaces of a life that was watched by more people than any human being should have to be watched by, without anyone who was watching fully understanding what the composed, smiling, increasingly assured woman at the center of it all was carrying behind the composure. They would understand eventually. Diana would make sure of it. The apartments at Kensington Palace are not what most people picture when they picture the place. The tourist version of Kensington Palace, the public rooms, the costumed guides, the gift shop near the exit, presents a building of formal grandeur, all high ceilings and period furniture, and the particular museum quality of spaces that have been preserved rather than lived in. The apartments where William and Diana actually lived, the private residential section that is separate from the public areas and considerably less photographed, were something different, larger than a civilian house certainly, grander in their proportions, but possessed in the accounts of people who actually spent time in them, of a quality of cold formality that was less about luxury than about the specific atmosphere of a place where the architecture has been designed to serve institutional functions rather than human comfort. The daily life inside those apartments, across the years of the Wales marriage, was governed by a set of arrangements that bore almost no resemblance to the domestic life the public image described. The image described warmth, a family, a young mother deeply invested in her children's lives, a father engaged when his duties permitted, the ordinary texture of a household where people who love each other move through the shared rhythms of daily existence. The image was built from carefully selected photographs and managed press briefings, and the occasional cooperative interview in which both parties said the correct things in the correct register. The reality, as described by the people who were inside it, the staff who saw the unmanaged moments, the friends who visited and observed, Diana herself in her most candid accounts, was of two people living substantially separate lives within a shared physical space, maintaining the appearance of domestic unity for the public-facing moments, and retreating, in between those moments, into the parallel existences that the size of the apartments and the structure of their respective schedules made possible. Charles had his rooms, Diana had hers. They did not share a bedroom in any sustained way after the early years of the marriage, and by the mid-1980s the physical separation of their private quarters had become an established domestic fact that the staff moved around without comment. Staff in royal households develop the particular professional skill of treating the arrangements they observe as unremarkable, regardless of what those arrangements actually are, and the arrangements at Kensington Palace required considerable treating as unremarkable. The mornings were largely separate. Charles was an early riser with a schedule that began before most of the household was active. His mornings had a ritual quality, the reading, the correspondence, the particular sequence of activities that a man who has lived his entire life inside structured routine develops as the container for the day. Diana's mornings were different, shaped by the children in the early years and by her own rhythms which ran later and less ceremonially than Charles's. The occasions when they occupied the same room for breakfast were scheduled rather than spontaneous. Staff described the particular quality of those shared meals, the surface courtesy, the conversations about the children's schedules and the public engagements and the logistical details of a shared life, conducted in a register that was neither warm nor hostile but simply managed. Two people who had learned to coexist in the space of a shared institutional role, handling the practical business of that role with professional competence, and maintaining the careful neutrality that prevents the surface from cracking. The staff were the silent witnesses to all of this. The people who laid the breakfast table and drove the cars and managed the household and answered the telephones and arranged the flowers and handled the 1,000 daily details that palace life requires. They saw the marriage from the angle that no camera ever captured. They saw the mornings before the performance began and the evenings after it ended. They saw the quality of interaction between two people when the awareness of being observed was reduced to whatever residual awareness remains when the observers have been so thoroughly absorbed into the background of daily life that they stop registering as observers. What they saw, and what some of them described in the carefully hedged terms that NDAs and social codes permit, was a marriage that had separated into its component parts. There was the public marriage, the appearances, the photographs, the official functions conducted side by side. There was the logistical marriage, the shared household, the children, the coordination of two complex schedules, and there was the emotional reality, which was not a marriage in any sense that the word is meant to convey, but two people whose emotional lives were located entirely elsewhere. Charles's emotional life was located, as it had always been, in his connection with Camilla. The telephone calls continued through the 1980s and into the 1990s with a regularity that the staff at Kensington Palace were aware of, and that Diana had long since stopped being shocked by. The calls happened in the evenings, typically when the children were in bed and the public schedule had concluded, and Charles was in his private rooms in the part of the apartment that Diana did not routinely enter. The staff who answered the palace telephones, who routed the calls, who were sometimes present when connections were made and broken, knew who called and when and in what pattern. They knew because that is what staff know. The management of a large household requires awareness of who is in contact with whom and when, and the people who manage those households carry that awareness even when they are professionally required to behave as if they do not. What the staff knew and what they did with knowing were two separate things. The NDAs that palace employees sign are comprehensive and enforceable, and the social code that operates alongside the legal one is perhaps even more powerful in practice. Staff who spoke about what they observed at Kensington Palace faced not just legal consequences, but the permanent end of their careers in any related field, and the social stigma of having broken the most fundamental rule of service, that you do not talk about the people you work for. Most of them did not talk. Some of them talked eventually after Diana died, and the legal and social pressures that had governed their silence shifted in the specific way that pressures shift when the person they were protecting is no longer alive to be protected. The picture that emerged from the accounts that eventually became available was consistent enough across multiple independent sources to carry weight. The picture was of a household conducting two separate lives under one roof, held together by the children and the public schedule and the institutional requirement that the surface be maintained, and gradually pulling apart along fault lines that had been present from the beginning, and that the daily reality of the marriage widened rather than closed. Diana's days were shaped increasingly through the mid-1980s by the public role she had discovered she was genuinely good at. The early engagements, the hospital visits, the school openings, the charity events had revealed something about Diana that neither she nor the institution had fully anticipated. She was extraordinarily effective at human connection on a scale that no one in the family had managed before. She did not do the royal walkabout in the manner of previous royals, maintaining the careful distance that the role traditionally imposed. She reached toward people, she touched them, she sat with them on hospital beds, and knelt to speak to children at their eye level, and held the hands of people who were dying in hospices, and looked directly at the people she was speaking to in a way that communicated something that the managed warmth of the traditional royal performance did not communicate. The public responded with something that went beyond the ordinary affection the monarchy's popularity generated. They responded with personal attachment, the specific emotional connection that people form with someone who makes them feel seen rather than observed. By the mid-1980s, the crowds at Diana's public appearances were of a size and a quality of engagement that the palace had not anticipated and did not quite know how to manage. She had become, without the institution's planning for it or particularly wanting it, the most powerful communicator the royal family had produced in the modern era. Charles noticed. The palace noticed. The noticing was not uncomplicated. On one level, Diana's public effectiveness was an institutional asset. The monarchy's approval ratings benefited from her popularity. The engagement and warmth she generated at public events reflected well on the institution as a whole, at least from a distance. The photographs of Diana with children and with patients and with ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances were the best advertisement the monarchy had for its own relevance. On another level, the specific nature of Diana's public effectiveness created problems. The problem was scale and quality. She was not merely popular, she was beloved in a way that outstripped Charles and in certain contexts outstripped the Queen herself. The crowds that came to see them at joint engagements were, visibly and awkwardly, primarily there for her. Charles stood beside his wife at public events and watched the crowd's attention orient almost entirely toward her, and the experience was not comfortable for a man who had spent his entire life at the formal center of every room he entered. The dynamic at joint engagements became, over the years, a source of friction that the public occasionally glimpsed in photographs. Charles's expression in certain unguarded moments, the quality of his body language beside Diana at events where her reception was warmest, the specific quality of distance that a person maintains when they are managing something they do not want to show. Diana was aware of the dynamic. She was, by the mid-1980s, aware of almost everything that happened in the rooms she moved through. the specific quality of attention she had developed in the early years of the marriage, the instinct for reading people and situations that had been sharpened by years of operating in circumstances where accurate reading was a survival skill, had made her an extremely precise observer of the people around her. She observed Charles at these events and she understood what she was seeing. She understood it not with satisfaction, the schadenfreude of a wronged spouse watching their partner struggle, but with the specific sadness of someone who can see clearly how a situation has developed and who understands that the development is not reversible. The marriage by the mid-1980s was a formal arrangement holding together things that had long since separated in every meaningful sense. The children were the connective tissue. George and Charlotte would come later for William, but William and Harry were the connective tissue of this marriage. The reason the arrangement continued to function, the daily reality that required both parents to be present in a shared domestic space and to maintain for the children's sake as much as the institutions, the surface of a household that made sense. Diana's approach to motherhood was shaped by everything she understood about her own situation. She had grown up in a broken home. Her parents' divorce when she was 7 had left marks that her adult life had not erased, and she understood from experience what children absorb when the adults around them are unhappy. She was determined that William and Harry would not absorb what she had absorbed, that they would have a mother who was present and warm and physically demonstrative in the way that the royal family's tradition of emotional restraint did not typically permit. She broke the restraint. She hugged her sons in public at school gates in front of cameras in ways that no previous royal mother had demonstrated publicly. She took them to McDonald's and to theme parks and to the cinema. She was photographed with them in ways that looked candid rather than staged, because they were often genuinely candid rather than staged. The motherhood was real and the public could see that it was real, and it was one of the few areas of her life where the gap between the private person and the public image was genuinely small. Charles's fatherhood was real too, in its way. He was not the absent father that the harshest versions of the story sometimes portray. He was present at Kensington Palace and at Highgrove, involved in the children's lives to the degree that his schedule and his temperament permitted. But his temperament was not Diana's temperament, and the contrast between his more formal, traditional approach to parenting and Diana's instinctive warmth was visible enough that the children registered it even when they were too young to name it. William particularly absorbed the marriage's reality through the specific sensitivity of a child who is paying attention to things adults around him believe he is too young to understand. Children understand more than the adults in their lives intend. They understand it differently, without language, without framework, through the embodied intelligence of someone whose entire experience is mediated by the emotional state of the people they depend on. William grew up in a household whose emotional temperature was unstable in ways he could not have named at 5 or 7 or 9 years old, and the instability left marks that his adult life would make visible. The daily reality of the marriage, inside Kensington Palace and at the other royal residences, Highgrove, Balmoral, Sandringham, was the reality of two people fulfilling the public requirements of a shared role, while the private reality was something else entirely. It required constant management from both of them, and the management consumed energy that was not available for anything else. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Diana's way of managing it evolved over the years from passive absorption to something more active. She began in the mid to late 1980s to develop her own networks, the friends outside the palace walls, the relationships that were genuinely hers rather than institutional products, the private conversations in which the stone could be set down for a moment and the weight of it acknowledged to people she trusted. The friendships she formed in this period were carefully chosen. They were chosen with the instinctive skill of someone who had learned through bitter experience the difference between people who were loyal to her and people who were loyal to the idea of her, or to the access she represented, or to the institution whose peripheral glow she cast on everyone around her. Not all of her choices were good ones. Some of the people she trusted turned out to be less trustworthy than she had assessed. The loneliness that had characterized the early years of the marriage had produced in Diana a hunger for genuine connection that occasionally overwhelmed the judgment that should have governed its satisfaction. She reached toward people sometimes in ways that the palace would later characterize as unstable, but that were more accurately the reaching of someone who had been isolated for too long and was trying imperfectly to rebuild a world of genuine human connection. The daily reality of the marriage, the separate rooms and the managed breakfasts and the joint appearances and the phone calls that continued in the evenings, and the children who absorbed all of it without knowing what they were absorbing, continued through the late 1980s with the grinding quality of something that has ceased to be sustainable but has not yet reached the point at which it breaks. The point was approaching, the management operation that the palace had deployed around the marriage, and that the marriage itself required from both parties, was consuming more than it was producing. The image was holding, but the effort required to hold it was increasing as the reality it was required to conceal became more difficult to conceal. Diana was no longer the pliant 20-year-old who had been managed into the role. She was a woman in her late 20s with a public standing that gave her resources the palace had not anticipated. She had allies carefully built. She had knowledge, the phone call and everything that had followed it, that the palace did not know she had been carrying for years. The daily reality of the marriage was producing in Diana something the institution had not prepared for when it selected her as the suitable candidate for the role of Charles's wife. It was producing a woman who was ready when the moment came to make the weight visible. The moment was not yet there. The management continued. The daily life inside Kensington Palace continued, with its separate rooms and its careful surfaces and its two children who played in the nursery above the managed silence of a marriage that was holding together by the thinnest of institutional threads. But the threads were fraying, and Diana, who had learned to read the texture of the world she lived in with extraordinary precision, could feel each one as it went. There is a particular kind of torment that belongs specifically to the person who knows something completely and can prove none of it. Not the torment of uncertainty, that has its own character. The specific anxiety of someone who suspects but cannot confirm, who moves through their daily life with the unresolved question always present at the edge of consciousness. The torment of complete knowledge without provable evidence is different. It is the torment of certainty without recourse, of being in possession of a truth that the world around you is structured to deny, and understanding that the denial will hold as long as the truth exists only inside you. Diana lived inside that torment for years. What she knew was comprehensive, not in every detail. She did not have dates and times and the specific content of every conversation, the itemized record that a legal proceeding would require. She had something more fundamental than that. She had the direct experience of a woman living inside a marriage that was not what it had been sold as, with full awareness of what it actually was, accumulated across years of daily evidence that each individually deniable piece had long since ceased to be individually deniable. She knew about Camilla. She had known since the phone call, and she had known in a less direct but accumulating way before it. She knew the relationship was ongoing, not a past attachment that Charles had failed to fully put behind him, not a friendship that had occasionally crossed lines, but a sustained, primary, emotionally central relationship that had continued through his engagement, through his wedding, through the births of his children, through the entirety of his marriage. She knew because the evidence was continuous. The phone calls, not just the one she had heard, but the pattern of them, the regularity she had become able to read in the texture of Charles's evenings, the specific quality of withdrawal that preceded them, and the specific quality of distance that followed them. The items, the letters she had found, the gifts she had identified, the cufflinks whose provenance she had eventually determined, the small material evidence of a relationship conducted in parallel with the one she was supposed to be inside, she knew because of the staff. Not from anything any of them told her directly, they were too well trained and too legally bound for that, but from the specific quality of certain silences, the careful neutrality that experienced staff maintain around subjects they know are sensitive, the occasionally too controlled reactions of people who have witnessed something and are professionally required to behave as if they have not. She knew from the social world, the people she and Charles moved through together, the aristocratic circles, the country house weekends, the formal and informal gatherings of the upper-class English world, knew about Charles and Camilla in the way that small worlds know about things, not officially, not in terms that would survive a legal challenge, but with the thoroughness of a community that has been watching two people for a long time and has reached its own conclusions. Diana moved through those gatherings with the knowledge that the people around her held their own version of what she knew, and with the additional knowledge that their version, second-hand, inferential, shaped by the social code's requirement to maintain plausible deniability, was less complete than hers, and that the gap between what they knew and what they felt able to say was a gap she inhabited alone. The knowing was complete, the provability was almost non-existent. This asymmetry is not accidental. The architecture of the Charles and Camilla relationship had been constructed, across decades, with a sophisticated attention to the maintenance of exactly this asymmetry. The care that had been taken, not necessarily consciously or strategically in every instance, but effectively in aggregate, to ensure that the relationship existed in a form that was known to the relevant people, but unconfirmable by any of them, was the care of people who understood what was at stake, and had developed the habits appropriate to the stakes. The telephone calls were made on private lines. The letters were handwritten and presumably not preserved in ways that made them accessible. The meetings happened in private houses belonging to people who were inside the same social code, and who understood that their hospitality required their silence. The entire architecture of the relationship was designed to exist in the space between what everyone understood and what anyone could prove. Diana had encountered this architecture from the inside, and had understood it completely. She understood that the knowledge she carried would not survive the specific kind of scrutiny that a confrontation or a formal proceeding would bring, because the knowledge was experiential rather than documentary, and experiential knowledge in a context where the other party denies it is, in the formal sense, unverifiable. She had tried in the early years to make the experiential knowledge into something more solid. The accounts of this period describe Diana attempting, carefully and through channels that did not risk full exposure, to gather something that could stand independent of her own testimony. She paid attention to patterns. She tracked the regularity of the calls. She noted the items and their provenance. She filed the social intelligence that came through the networks of people who knew pieces of the picture, holding each piece against the others to see what the aggregate shape produced. The aggregate shape was clear. It was always clear. The problem was not that the picture was ambiguous. The problem was that a picture assembled from inference and pattern and experiential knowledge is exactly the kind of picture that can be reframed by a sufficiently motivated and resourced opposing party as the product of a troubled mind connecting dots that are not actually connected. The palace understood this. The framing of Diana as unstable, which became increasingly explicit in the briefings against her in the late 1980s and early 1990s, was not simply a cruel institutional response to an inconvenient woman. It was a specific strategy for managing the provability problem in reverse, not by producing evidence that Diana's knowledge was wrong, but by undermining the credibility of Diana as a knower, so that what she knew became irrelevant regardless of its accuracy. The strategy was sophisticated and brutal and largely effective for the period during which it was deployed. The mental health difficulties that Diana genuinely experienced, the bulimia, the depression, the self-harm, were real, and the palace did not fabricate them. But their meaning was systematically reframed. The institutional account of these difficulties positioned them as evidence of instability rather than as evidence of what it actually was, the comprehensible response of a person who had been placed in an impossible situation and denied any legitimate outlet for the truth of what she was experiencing. The genius of the strategy from the palace's perspective was that it required no fabrication. It required only the selective presentation of real facts in a context that stripped them of their actual meaning. Diana was unstable. This was documentably true in the narrow clinical sense. Diana's perception of her marriage was distorted by her instability. This conclusion followed from the first only if you refused to engage with the causes of the instability, which the institutional framing systematically refused to do. Diana understood this framing. She understood it with the clarity of someone who has been told repeatedly and through multiple channels that their accurate perception of reality is a symptom of their mental health problems. That specific form of gaslighting, the weaponization of genuine difficulty against the person experiencing the difficulty, has a particular effect on the person subjected to it. It does not, in Diana's case, appear to have produced the intended effect of making her doubt her own perception. It appears to have produced the opposite, a steely determination to find a way to make her knowledge credible that did not depend on the credibility the institution was working to destroy. The challenge she was working against was real. In the formal sense, she could prove almost nothing. She had no recordings of the telephone calls. The technology and the presence of mind to record them had not been available at the moments that mattered. She had no documentary evidence of the relationship that could withstand legal challenge. She had no named witnesses willing to testify to what they had observed. She had her own account, her own perception, her own experience, and she had learned through the institutional response to her earlier attempts to make that experience known that her own account was exactly what the palace had spent years rendering insufficient. The gap between what she knew and what she could prove was the gap the institution lived in. It was the gap that made the management operation possible, that allowed the image to continue functioning, that kept the surface intact year after year regardless of what was happening underneath it. Closing that gap required something that Diana did not yet have, and that the institution could not prevent her from eventually acquiring: public standing so substantial, and public sympathy so broad and so personally directed, that her account of her own experience would carry weight independent of the documentary evidence the palace's architecture had been designed to prevent her from accumulating. She was building that standing through the 1980s, through the public engagement that had made her the most beloved member of the family she had married into. Every hospital visit, every hospice, every AIDS ward, every public appearance in which she connected with people in the unguarded, direct, entirely unregal way that had become her signature. Each one was adding to a reserve of public trust that would eventually give her words a weight no document could have provided. The institution did not see this clearly enough in the years when it was happening. It saw Diana's popularity as a mixed blessing, an asset for the monarchy's approval ratings, a complication for the management of the marriage narrative. What it did not fully appreciate was that the specific nature of Diana's public connection, personal, reciprocal, based on the perception of her as a genuine human being rather than a performed role, was building something that would eventually function as an alternative to the documentary evidence she could not obtain. What Diana knew but could not prove could become, in the right conditions, something different. What Diana said, heard by people who believed her not because she could prove it, but because they had received her as real across years of public contact, and found the account she gave consistent with the person they believed they had come to know. The Bashir interview in 1995 was the moment when this strategy reached its conclusion. The interview was not a spontaneous decision. It was the product of years of preparation, of the careful accumulation of the public standing that made it possible, of the specific timing that Diana had been working towards since the early years of the marriage. She could not prove what she knew in any formal sense, but she could say it, in public, to an audience of millions of people who had been prepared, over 15 years of public contact, to receive her account as credible. The institution had spent years building the case that Diana was an unreliable narrator of her own experience. Diana had spent years building the counter-case, without announcing that she was building it, in every public appearance and every human connection and every moment of genuine warmth with people who were nobody in the institutional sense and everybody in the human one. By 1995, the counter-case was built, the audience was prepared, the moment had arrived. But before the interview, before the public disclosure, before the calculated break with the silence strategy that had governed her behavior for over a decade, there was still the private reality of what she knew and what she had done with knowing it in the years between the phone call and the moment she chose to speak. What she had done was observe, accumulate, understand the full shape of the thing she was inside, map its dimensions and its mechanisms and its dependencies, the way a person maps a room they expect to have to navigate in the dark. She had mapped it completely. Charles and Camilla and the architecture of their relationship, the palace apparatus and its management techniques, the social world and its codes and how those codes operated to maintain the silence that the arrangement required, the staff and what they knew and why they were silent, and what the conditions were under which silence is maintained and under which it eventually breaks. She had mapped all of it, over years, with the specific intelligence of someone who understands that knowledge is only power when it is ready to be used, and who is willing to wait until it is ready. What she knew remained, formally, unprovable. What she was preparing to do with it was something that did not require proof in the legal sense. It required only an audience and a moment, and the willingness to say in her own voice what her own experience had been. The audience was ready. The moment was approaching. The willingness had been building since the day she put the phone down and stood alone in a room in Kensington Palace with a stone in her hands that she had just decided she would one day find a way to set down. Diana was not in any literal sense alone with what she knew. The aloneness she experienced was real, the specific isolation of someone whose knowledge cannot be shared in any context that would make a difference, whose truth exists in a world that is structured to deny it, whose account of her own experience has been systematically positioned as unreliable. That isolation was genuine, and its costs were substantial, and it shaped everything about how Diana moved through the years of her marriage. But the knowledge itself was not exclusively hers. It was distributed in fragments and partial versions and varying degrees of completeness across a range of people who moved through the world of the Wales marriage, and who each held their piece of the picture in the specific way their position required them to hold it. The staff held the most complete version outside Diana's own, not because they were told things or included in confidences. The architecture of royal household employment is specifically designed to prevent that kind of lateral information sharing, but because they were present, continuously and invisibly, in the spaces where the private reality of the marriage was most visible. They laid the tables and drove the cars and answered the telephones and managed the domestic logistics of two separate lives conducted under one institutional roof, and the accumulated weight of what they observed across years of that proximity was substantial. The butlers and the valets and the ladies' maids and the protection officers and the private secretaries and the housekeeping staff and the kitchen staff, each group had access to a different stratum of the household's private reality, and each group maintained its silence through a combination of legal obligation, professional code, and the practical understanding that their livelihoods depended on the maintenance of that silence. The legal obligation was the NDA, comprehensive and enforceable, and signed as a condition of employment. But experienced palace observers have always understood that the NDA is not the primary mechanism of staff silence, it is the backup. The primary mechanism is the professional culture, the understanding, absorbed through training and modeling, and the institutional memory of a workforce that has been producing domestically silent employees for generations, that speaking about what you observe in royal service is simply not what people in this profession do. It is a categorical violation of the professional identity, not just a legal risk. Paul Burrell, Diana's butler and one of the people closest to her in the later years of the marriage, eventually became the most public example of how that culture and its limits operated. His 2002 memoir and his subsequent public statements were, from the palace's perspective, exactly the kind of staff disclosure the system was designed to prevent. The legal action initially brought against him and the circumstances of its abandonment revealed something about the palace's management of staff knowledge, specifically that the management was not invulnerable and that the conditions under which staff silence holds are not unconditional. Burrell's disclosures were significant but carefully calibrated. He spoke about Diana's inner life, her fears, her private communications, the texture of her daily existence inside the palace. He did not in his public statements provide the kind of direct testimony about Charles and Camilla that would have been legally actionable and institutionally catastrophic. The calibration was probably not accidental. He understood the limits of what he could say without crossing lines that would expose him to consequences he was not prepared to absorb. Other staff members, unnamed and uncitable, spoke in more limited ways through the years following Diana's death, to biographers, to journalists working on background, to the researchers who have spent decades assembling the most complete available picture of what the Wales marriage actually looked like from the inside. The picture that assembled from these accounts was consistent in its broad outlines. Two people living separate lives within a shared institution, the primary emotional reality of the husband's life located elsewhere, the wife carrying the knowledge of this with a composure that the staff simultaneously respected and understood as costing her something visible. The protection officers occupied a particular position in the knowledge landscape. These were the men, and they were predominantly men, who were physically closest to Diana in the public and semi-public spaces of her life. They drove the cars. They stood in the corridors outside the rooms where things happened. They accompanied her on engagements and to private meetings and on the movements through London and the country that constituted her daily geography. Protection officers are trained to see everything and acknowledge nothing. Their professional function requires a quality of omnidirectional attention that makes them, whether they intend to be or not, repositories of information about the people they protect. Diana's protection officers over the years accumulated knowledge of her life and its reality that was, in some respects, more comprehensive than anyone else's, including, in certain dimensions, Diana's own. Some of them spoke, eventually, in the context of the investigations and inquiries that followed Diana's death and in the books and documentaries that have continued to explore her life in the decades since. What they spoke about was shaped by the same calibration that governed Burrell's disclosures, enough to confirm the general picture without providing the specific details that would cross legal or professional lines that could not be uncrossed. The picture they confirmed was the picture the other sources described: the separate lives, the telephone calls, the quality of Diana's daily management of a knowledge she carried without visible acknowledgement, the specific incidents not named in ways that would be legally actionable, but described in terms that made their nature clear to anyone paying attention, that had contributed to Diana's understanding of what her marriage was. The friends occupied a different position. Not staff, not institutionally bound in the same legal way, but subject to their own version of the code, the social code of the world they and Diana shared, which prized discretion and managed silence in ways that were enforced by belonging rather than by law. Diana's friends in this period were a carefully assembled group chosen through the instinctive process she had developed for distinguishing people who were genuinely loyal from people who were loyal to the idea of her or to what proximity to her provided. The group included people from before the royal life, whose friendship predated the princess and who therefore had some basis for loyalty that was independent of the title. It included people she had met through her public work: doctors, therapists, charity workers, people whose professional lives brought them into contact with suffering in ways that had resonated with Diana's own understanding of what suffering looked like and felt like from the inside. The friends knew more than the staff in one sense because Diana told them things, not everything, and not always directly. Diana's way of sharing the private reality of her marriage was rarely frontal. She was more likely to convey things obliquely, through the texture of what she said about her daily life, through what she omitted, through the quality of feeling she brought to conversations about Charles, that communicated more than the literal content of the words. But the people who were close to her understood the shape of what she was living, and some of them received more direct communications about specific things she had learned. The phone call, for example, the specific knowledge of the Camilla relationship's ongoing nature, confirmed rather than suspected. Diana shared this, at various points and in various forms, with people she trusted enough to carry it. The sharing was itself a form of the managed disclosure she would eventually perfect. Strategic in its selectivity, careful in what it revealed and to whom, building toward something rather than simply venting, the friends carried what she gave them with varying degrees of fidelity. Some of them, the most trusted ones, maintained the confidences completely, others less completely. The social world Diana moved in was not hermetically sealed, and the flow of information through it was not fully controllable by any individual, including Diana. What she shared moved in the way that private information always moves through small connected worlds, further than she sometimes intended. The palace was aware that Diana had a network. It was aware that the network carried information. Its response to this awareness was the management approach it applied to everything, monitoring where it could, applying pressure through the social and institutional levers available to it, attempting to ensure that the information moving through Diana's network did not reach the points where it could become publicly damaging. The monitoring was real. Diana became aware at various points that her communications were being observed in ways that went beyond the ordinary security arrangements that protected senior royals. The specific mechanisms of that observation, whether it extended to telephone interception, to the cultivation of sources within her social network, to the surveillance of her movements and meetings, have been a subject of ongoing speculation and investigation, including in the formal inquiries that followed her death. What is clear is that Diana operated in conditions where she could not assume the privacy of her communications, and that this awareness shaped how she communicated and through which channels and with what degree of directness. She learned to be careful, more careful than came naturally to someone whose instinct was toward openness and direct human connection. The carefulness was a response to an environment she understood, with good reason, to be surveilled. The palace, meanwhile, was managing its own version of the knowledge problem. The people within the institution who knew the full picture, or as close to full as anyone outside the marriage itself could access, were the senior courtiers and advisors who had been managing the Wales situation since before the engagement. These were people who had known about Charles and Camilla before the marriage, who had made the institutional calculation that the marriage should proceed regardless, and who had been managing the consequences of that calculation ever since. Their knowledge was the most complete and the most dangerous from an institutional perspective, because it included not just knowledge of the Charles and Camilla relationship, but knowledge of the institutional decisions that had produced the marriage and the institutional management that had sustained it. They knew not just what had happened, but what had been decided, and by whom, and on the basis of what calculation. That knowledge, if it ever became fully public, would implicate the institution not as the passive background to a personal drama, but as an active agent in the construction and maintenance of a specific deception. The courtiers who carried this knowledge were, by professional formation and personal investment, the most reliably silent people in the entire landscape. Their careers, their social standing, their sense of professional identity, all of it was bound up in the institution they served. Speaking would have required them to become something other than what they were, in a more fundamental way than it required of anyone else in the knowledge landscape. They did not speak. Some of them wrote, eventually, in the careful memoirs that senior royal servants produce in retirement, books that are full of observation and empty of the specific disclosures that would actually illuminate the decisions that shaped what they observed. The memoirs are monuments to managed disclosure, to the art of saying a great deal while revealing very little that the reader could not have inferred from sources that were already public. The result of all this distributed silence was a situation in which an enormous amount of knowledge was in circulation about the Wales marriage's private reality, held by a large number of people across the staff and the social world and the institutional structure, and in which precisely none of that knowledge was available in a form that could be directly and publicly attributed. Diana understood this landscape completely. She had been inside it for years, watching how it worked, understanding which silences were absolute and which had cracks, learning the specific conditions under which people who held knowledge decided to move it from private to something more available. The conditions were always the same. People spoke when the cost of silence exceeded the cost of speaking, when the personal loyalty that had sustained the silence was removed by death or betrayal or the passage of time past the point where the original relationship retained its hold, when the legal protections that had enforced the silence were weakened by circumstance, when the social codes that had governed the silence became less binding because the world that enforced them had changed. Diana was watching for those conditions. She was watching for the cracks in the silences around her, and she was paying attention to which of the people who held pieces of the picture might, under the right conditions, allow those pieces to become more available. She was also simultaneously and more importantly building the conditions under which her own disclosure, the most significant piece, the direct testimony of the person who had been inside the marriage, would have maximum effect. The staff knew, the friends knew, the courtiers knew, the palace knew, the social world knew, in its oblique, officially deniable, collectively maintained way. None of them had spoken in any form that had made a difference. The knowledge was distributed across a landscape of managed silence, held by people who each had their own reasons for maintaining it, in a configuration that had proven durable across more than a decade. But durable is not permanent, and the specific architecture of distributed silence that the palace had constructed around the Wales marriage had one vulnerability that it could not fully engineer away. It depended for its continued function on all of the people who held the knowledge continuing to hold it simultaneously. In a world where the conditions that produced their silence were maintained indefinitely, the conditions were not maintained indefinitely. They changed, as conditions always change, through the ordinary passage of time and the ordinary human tendency to reach, eventually, the limit of what can be carried indefinitely in silence. Diana reached that limit first. She reached it because she was carrying more than anyone else, and because the carrying was costing her more than anyone else, and because she had spent the longest time preparing for the moment when carrying would give way to something else. That moment was approaching. The other people who knew would watch it arrive, from their various positions in the knowledge landscape, and they would each make their own calculations about what it meant for their own silences. Some of those calculations would produce more silence. Some would eventually produce something else. The decision to speak did not arrive as a decision. It arrived as the gradual accumulating recognition that the alternative had become impossible, that the specific conditions under which the silence had been rational, the isolation, the absence of allies, the insufficiency of her public standing to carry the weight of her testimony, had changed enough that the calculation no longer produced the same result. That the thing she had been building across 15 years of public life had reached the point where it could bear what she needed to put on it. Diana did not wake up one morning in 1994 or 1995 and decide to give an interview. She arrived at the interview through a process that had been underway since the early years of the marriage, a slow, non-linear movement from the complete silence of the phone call's aftermath toward the controlled, calibrated, strategically timed disclosure of a woman who had spent a decade and a half preparing for a moment she had always known, at some level, was coming. The road to the Bashir interview runs through several earlier disclosures that established the pattern and tested the mechanisms. Understanding those earlier disclosures is necessary for understanding what the Bashier interview was. Not an explosion of private truth made suddenly public, but the final and most visible stage of a disclosure strategy that had been operating for years. The first significant stage was Andrew Morton. The book that was published in 1992 as Diana, Her True Story was received by the public as a revelation and by the palace as an act of war. Both receptions were understandable and both were in important ways incomplete. The revelation was real. Morton's book contained material about Diana's private experience of the marriage, the eating disorder, the self-harm, the depression, the specific ways the institution had failed her that had never been publicly available before. The material was accurate. Diana had provided it in the recordings she made for Morton in the private sessions that the palace did not know about and could not have prevented if it had known, because Diana by that point had developed the means to communicate with people outside the palace's surveillance in ways that reduced the institution's ability to intercept. The act of war framing was also real, in the sense that the palace experienced it as an attack, but the framing misunderstood the nature of what Diana had done. She had not declared war. She had executed the first stage of a disclosure strategy with surgical precision, providing Morton with material that illuminated the personal cost of the marriage without providing the specific material about Charles and Camilla that would have been legally actionable and that she was not yet ready to deploy. The calibration was deliberate and important. Diana gave Morton enough to establish the picture of a woman who had been failed by the institution and whose account of that failure was credible. She did not give him enough to trigger the full institutional response that the most explosive material would have triggered. The palace was furious. It briefed against the book aggressively. It positioned Diana as unstable and the material as the product of a troubled mind. But it could not deny the book's core claims, because the claims were documented in Diana's own voice on recordings that Morton retained, and that Diana could not be pressured to retract without also implicating herself in the initial deception of their provenance. The Morton disclosures changed Diana's public position in ways that the palace had not anticipated. They did not destroy her standing, they increased it. The public that received the book received it not as the disloyal ravings of a difficult woman, but as the testimony of a person they had been watching for over a decade and whose apparent warmth and genuineness they had come to trust. The account Diana gave of her experience was consistent with everything about her that they had observed. It fit. It filled the outlines of something they had been half perceiving for years without having the language to name. The palace's response to this development was to escalate the briefing against Diana and to accelerate the management of the marriage's formal dissolution. The separation was announced in December 1992. The announcement was framed as a mutual decision arrived at with mutual respect. The framing was, as with all palace framings, technically not false in ways that mattered and practically misleading in ways that mattered considerably more. The separation changed the conditions under which Diana operated in ways that were simultaneously liberating and threatening. The formal acknowledgement that the marriage was over removed some of the institutional constraints on her behavior. She was no longer required to perform the unity of a functioning marriage in quite the same way, because the performance had been officially discontinued. But it also changed her relationship to the institution's protection, which had always been contingent on her cooperation and which became more explicitly contingent after the separation. The years between the separation in 1992 and the Bashir interview in 1995 were years in which Diana was navigating a significantly changed landscape with the same strategic intelligence she had always brought to her navigation of the palace world. She was no longer fully inside the institution. She was not yet fully outside it. She occupied the specific liminal space of someone who has begun a departure that is not yet complete, and the decisions she made in that space were shaped by her understanding of what the completion of the departure would require. The completion would require, above everything else, a public account of the marriage that was hers rather than the palace's. The palace's account, managed through sympathetic journalists, delivered through courtiers, shaped by the briefing operation that had been running for years, was a version of events in which Diana's difficulties were personal pathologies, and Charles's behavior was the reasonable response of a man coping with an unreasonable situation. That account was in wide circulation. It was not yet dominant, but it was present, and it was being actively maintained by people with resources and institutional access that Diana could not match through conventional channels. The Bashier interview was the unconventional channel. Martin Bashir was a journalist whose manner of approach to Diana, direct, apparently sympathetic, explicitly interested in her account rather than the palace's account, was calibrated to reach someone who had good reasons to distrust conventional royal journalism and its dependencies on institutional access. Whether Bashir's sympathy was entirely genuine, and whether the means by which he secured the interview were entirely legitimate, are questions that later investigations would raise with damaging effect. The subsequent revelations about Bashir's methods, the fabricated bank statements, the false suggestion that Diana's confidants were being paid to spy on her, tarnished the interview's provenance without in any honest assessment, discrediting the substance of what Diana said in it. What Diana said in it was, in its essentials, what she had known since the phone call, and had been carrying for over a decade. She said the marriage had not been what it appeared to the public. She said there had been 3 people in the marriage. She said the 3 people were herself, Charles, and Camilla Parker Bowles. She said this directly, without circumlocution, in the plain language of someone who has rehearsed the saying enough times in private, that the saying itself has become simply the truth stated in the most honest available words. The phrase, "there were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded," has been quoted so often that it has acquired the quality of a historical set piece, something that exists in the cultural memory as a moment rather than as a piece of testimony. But it was testimony. It was the direct, unambiguous statement of what Diana had known since the phone call, that the marriage she had entered had been from its beginning an institution housing something other than the relationship it publicly described. The interview was watched by 23 million people in the United Kingdom on the night it aired. The global audience was considerably larger. The public's reception was overwhelmingly one of recognition rather than shock. The recognition was the product of 15 years of contact with Diana as a public figure, years in which the public had formed its own assessment of who she was and had been receiving, through the managed image of her marriage, a version of her life that did not quite fit that assessment. The interview made the fit visible. It connected the Diana the public had come to believe they understood, the warm, direct, genuinely human woman who touched AIDS patients and sat with dying people and made children feel seen, with the experience she had been having behind the image, and the connection produced the specific response of recognition that comes when a thing you suspected is confirmed. The palace's response to the interview was swift and devastating in its institutional consequences. The Queen wrote to both Charles and Diana in December 1995, the month after the interview aired, advising them that an early divorce was desirable. The advice was not a request. It was an institutional directive dressed in the language of parental concern, and both parties understood it as what it was. The divorce proceedings began in 1996 and were concluded with the final decree in August of that year. The divorce settlement stripped Diana of her HRH title. She became Diana, Princess of Wales, rather than Her Royal Highness the Princess of Wales, and removed her from the official structure of the monarchy in ways that were simultaneously practical and symbolic. Practically, it removed the institutional protections and resources that had come with her position. Symbolically, it was the palace's final formal statement about who had broken the contract and what the breaking cost. Diana did not experience the loss of the HRH title as devastating. The accounts of people close to her in this period describe someone who was, for the first time in 15 years, experiencing something that resembled freedom. The freedom was incomplete and was accompanied by threats and uncertainties that had their own weight. But the specific burden of maintaining the silence, the daily renewal of the choice not to say what she knew, the management of the gap between the private knowledge and the public performance, had been partially lifted by the saying of it. She had not said everything. The Bashier interview was calibrated, as all of Diana's disclosures were calibrated, to say what the moment required without exhausting the full reserve of what she knew. The three people in the marriage, the acknowledgement that the marriage had not been what it appeared, the humanity of her own experience told in her own voice to an audience that received it as credible. She had not provided the documentary evidence she had never been able to accumulate. She had not named dates and specifics. She had not gone into the technical detail that a legal proceeding would require. But she had said the essential thing in a context where the essential thing could be received as what it was, the testimony of a direct witness given voluntarily in the only court that had ever been available to her, the court of public opinion. The court whose membership included the 23 million people watching on the evening of November 20th, 1995, and the considerably larger number who formed their view of the Wales marriage from what those 23 million people received and discussed and carried into the ongoing public conversation about the institution Diana had married into and what it had done to her. The silence had broken. Not completely, not in every dimension. The full knowledge Diana carried remained incompletely disclosed, held in the reserve that she had maintained even at the moment of maximum disclosure. But the essential truth had been spoken in her own voice, and it had been received in the way she had spent 15 years preparing for it to be received. What came after the interview, the divorce, the removal of the title, the continued palace management of the aftermath, the specific events of the summer of 1997, is part of a different chapter of the story. But the chapter that began with the phone call, with the stone placed in her hands in a room in Kensington Palace, closed with the interview. The stone had been set down. Not completely, not finally. There was still weight in what remained unsaid, and there would have been more saying, more disclosure, more of the managed truth-telling that Diana had refined into a specific art form, if she had lived. She did not live. The remainder of what she knew died with her in the tunnel in August 1997, in the specific and permanent silence that no management operation orders and no institutional calculation produces. The palace, which had spent 15 years managing Diana's silence, had not managed for that silence. No one had. Diana died on the 31st of August 1997, and the world stopped in a way that the world rarely stops. Not the ordinary cessation of a news cycle pausing for a significant death. Something more fundamental, the specific global arrest that happens when a person who has been held in common emotional possession by an enormous number of people is suddenly and violently removed. The flowers outside Kensington Palace, the queues stretching for miles in the September heat, the book of condolences, the particular quality of collective grief that has no precise precedent in the modern era, and that the institution she had left was completely unprepared to manage. The palace's initial response to Diana's death was the response of an institution that had spent 15 years managing her as a problem and had not yet recalibrated to the reality that the problem had become, overnight, a martyr. The Queen remained at Balmoral. The flag above Buckingham Palace did not fly at half-mast because royal protocol held that the flag flew only when the monarch was in residence, and grief was not considered sufficient reason to deviate from protocol. The children were kept in Scotland away from the public eye, in a decision that was institutionally logical and publicly catastrophic. The public's response to the palace's initial handling of the death was the most direct challenge to the institution's management of public sentiment that it had faced since the abdication. The anger was real and it was specific, not Republican anger at the institution's existence, but the anger of people who felt that the institution was failing, in the moment of maximum public grief, to respond with the human acknowledgement the moment required. Charles was at Balmoral with his sons and his mother, and the apparatus of the institution that had spent the previous 5 years briefing against his former wife. The position he occupied in the public imagination in those first days after the crash was the worst position he had ever occupied. Not the unfaithful husband of the Morton book, not the cold, inadequate partner of the Bashir interview, but the man who had been part of the architecture of a marriage that had produced the specific misery that Diana had described, watching the world grieve for her from behind the walls of a Scottish castle. The rehabilitation that followed was one of the most significant institutional management achievements of the modern monarchy. It did not happen quickly. It did not happen through a single decision or a single event. It happened through the patient, sustained, strategically managed process of reintroducing Charles to the public in a way that gradually shifted the dominant narrative from the unfaithful husband to the mature statesman. But the rehabilitation had a specific dependency. It required above everything else the resolution of the Camilla question. Camilla Parker Bowles, in the weeks and months after Diana's death, was in the most exposed position of her life. She had been named by Diana herself in front of 23 million viewers as the third person in the marriage. She had been the subject of years of public hostility that the post-Diana grief intensified to a degree that made her public appearances essentially impossible. The polling on public attitudes toward Camilla in late 1997 and through 1998 was, from the palace's perspective, alarming. Large majorities of the British public expressed negative views, and the specific nature of the negativity was the kind that management operations have the most difficulty with, because it was grounded in knowledge of real events rather than misapprehension. The palace's management of the Camilla rehabilitation required a sustained patience that tested the limits of even the institution's considerable capacity for long-term strategic thinking. It could not be rushed. The public needed time for the acute grief to soften into something more manageable, time for the specific anger at Camilla to lose its edge, time for the people who had watched the Bashier interview and formed their judgment to begin, through the ordinary operation of time and fresh events, to update that judgment. The management operation worked on several fronts simultaneously. The first front was controlled visibility. Camilla was not pushed into the public eye in the immediate aftermath of Diana's death. She remained largely private, appearing occasionally in contexts that were not officially royal, at private events, in photographs released through sympathetic channels, in the carefully managed trickle of images that established her as a real, human, non-threatening person, rather than the abstract villain of the public narrative. The images mattered. The specific visual representation of Camilla in the public imagination in 1997 and 1998 was the image of a woman who had been photographed most often in contexts that emphasized her as the other woman. The photographs with Charles that had appeared in the press over the years, the images associated with the Morton book and the Bashier interview, the visual vocabulary of transgression and concealment. The management operation worked to replace that vocabulary with a different one: the country house weekend, the outdoor event, the casual and unguarded moment that read as normal rather than furtive. The second front was social rehabilitation. Camilla's reintroduction to the public social world happened through the network of aristocratic and institutional connections that the British establishment maintains with considerable effectiveness. She began to appear at events where the social world's approval of her presence served as an implicit endorsement. Not royal events, not official occasions, but the kind of gathering where the presence of the right people signals acceptability to the people who calibrate their own social judgments by the calibrations of those around them. The third front was the management of Charles's public image in relation to Camilla. The shift from concealment to normalization required a gradual disclosure of the relationship's existence and durability that the palace handled with care, not acknowledging the relationship in terms that would confirm the worst of what Diana had described, but allowing it to become visible enough that the public could begin to process it as a fact rather than a transgression. The trajectory of this managed normalization is visible in retrospect with a clarity that was not fully available to people watching it in real time. The 1998 photograph of Charles and Camilla together at a public event, the first time they had been photographed together officially, was the most significant single step in the rehabilitation sequence. It was received with some negativity but less than the palace had feared. which confirmed that the groundwork of the previous year had produced some movement in public sentiment. The movement was slow, but it was consistent. Year by year through the late 1990s and into the 2000s, the specific anger that had characterized public attitudes toward Camilla softened, not disappeared. There remained, and perhaps still remains, a proportion of the public for whom the specific history of the Charles and Camilla relationship is permanently disqualifying. But the proportion of that public was declining, and the proportion of the public that had arrived at a pragmatic acceptance was growing. The palace was calibrating its management of the relationship against this shifting public sentiment, with the attention of people who understood that timing was everything. Normalize too quickly and the resistance hardens. Too slowly and the relationship becomes the dominant story of Charles's public identity in a way that prevents him from establishing any other public identity. The calibration required a sustained reading of public sentiment and a willingness to adjust the pace of exposure in response to what the reading showed. What the management operation was protecting through all of this was something larger than Camila's reputation or Charles's relationship. It was protecting the specific narrative of the Charles and Camilla relationship that was most advantageous to the institution, the narrative of two people who had loved each other for decades, who had been denied the straightforward expression of that love by institutional requirements, and who had eventually, after years of difficulty and loss and the slow, patient process of public rehabilitation, arrived at the formal recognition that the love deserved. That narrative required the excision of certain elements. It required the quieting of Diana's account of what the relationship had meant from the inside of the marriage it had occupied. It required the management of the specific detail, the years during which the relationship had been conducted alongside the marriage, the specific evidence of its continuity through the honeymoon and the births of the children and the entirety of Diana's married life. That would complicate the romantic narrative with elements of calculation and sustained deception. The management operation worked on those elements through the mechanism it applied to everything difficult, not denial, which would have been legally and factually unsustainable, but the strategic deployment of silence and time. The specific details were not discussed. The questions they raised were not engaged with directly. The sympathetic commentators who shaped public understanding of the royal family were supplied with the romantic narrative and the institutional narrative and the narrative of eventual resolution, and the gaps in those narratives, the gaps where Diana's account of the marriage's interior reality would have fit, were managed by simply not filling them. The public, by and large, accepted this, not because they were naive or because the management operation was perfect. It was neither. But because the passage of time and the availability of a more comfortable narrative and the natural human preference for resolution over irresolution produced a reception of the managed story that was more favorable than an honest accounting of the events would have generated. By the time of Charles and Camilla's wedding in April 2005, the public sentiment had shifted enough that the ceremony was received with a muted goodwill that would have been unimaginable in 1997. The ceremony was deliberately modest, a civil ceremony at Windsor Guildhall rather than a church wedding, a blessing rather than a full religious service, a scale and presentation that acknowledged the complicated history without foregrounding it. The modesty was itself part of the management. It said, without saying, that the palace understood what had happened and was not asking the public to celebrate it unreservedly, only to accept it. The acceptance was broadly given, not unanimously. Not without the residual unhappiness of people who had loved Diana and who experienced the formalization of the relationship that had contributed to her suffering as a final institutional statement about whose interests the monarchy ultimately served, but broadly given. The silence that Diana had maintained for years, the silence that had eventually broken in the Bashir interview and that had been partially restored by the management operation in the years between the interview and the crash, had been succeeded by a different silence, the silence of a public that had received the managed narrative and had not been provided with the tools or the material to construct a more complete account. The silence protected specific things. It protected the romantic version of Charles and Camilla's relationship, which required the specific details of its history to remain incompletely examined. It protected the institutional decisions that had produced the marriage to Diana, the calculation that an heir was required, that Diana was suitable, that the Camilla relationship could be managed alongside the marriage without consequence. It protected the people who had made those decisions, who were still alive and still connected to the institution, and who had every interest in the decision's institutional logic remaining unexamined. It protected most fundamentally the institution itself, the specific version of the institution that the management of the Wales marriage and its aftermath had produced, in which the events of the previous 20 years were filed as a difficult chapter that had produced, eventually, a resolution, rather than as an ongoing set of questions about what the institution was and what it was willing to do to the people inside it. What the silence could not protect, permanently, was the record, not the official record, which the institution largely controlled. The other record, the one that exists in the testimony of people who were there, in the books that have continued to be written, in the investigations that have continued to be conducted, in the specific durable human tendency to keep asking questions about things that matter, the questions about Charles and Camilla, about the marriage to Diana and what it actually was and what the institution actually did, have not stopped. They have continued in the background of everything, of Charles's eventual accession to the throne, of the coronation, of the ongoing public life of the monarchy. They continue in the background of William and Harry's lives, in the specific ways that the unresolved questions of parents' lives continue in the background of the lives of their children. They continue in the accounts of the people who were inside the story, and who have, over the years and in various forms and with various degrees of completeness, added to the available picture. The picture is more complete than the palace intended it to be, and less complete than the full truth would require. The gap between those two versions of completeness is where the institution lives. It has always lived there. It is perhaps the essential location of all institutions that survive by managing what the public knows about them, rather than by being honest about what they are. The survival continues. The questions continue alongside it. Diana's account, the one she gave in the Bashir interview, the one that began with the phone call in Kensington Palace and ended with the phrase about 3 people in a marriage, remains the most direct testimony in the public record about what the managed silence was managing. She said it in her own voice, to an audience that received it as credible, at a moment she had spent 15 years preparing for. The institution has spent the years since managing the legacy of her saying it, with the same tools it applied to managing everything else, with the same mixture of success and incompleteness that characterizes all management operations conducted against the grain of an underlying truth. The truth was spoken. The speaking is part of the record. The record does not disappear because the institution prefers it to. William was 15 years old when his mother died. Harry was 12. The specific ages matter because they describe 2 boys at different points in the developmental process through which children move from absorbing the world around them to being able to analyze what they have absorbed. William at 15 was old enough to have formed a conscious understanding of significant parts of what his parents' marriage had contained. Harry at 12 was old enough to have absorbed the emotional reality of the household without yet having the full cognitive framework to organize what he had absorbed into something that made sense. Both of them had grown up inside the marriage's private reality in the way that children grow up inside the atmospheres their parents create. Not through being told things, not through conscious instruction, but through the continuous, unavoidable experience of being present in a household whose emotional weather they could feel even when they could not name it. The household's emotional weather across the years of William and Harry's childhoods had been what this account has attempted to describe: 2 people living separate lives within a shared institutional space, one of them carrying a knowledge that the other did not know she carried, both of them maintaining for the children's benefit as much as any other reason, a surface of domestic normality that was the product of sustained effort rather than underlying reality. Children feel the effort. They cannot name it as effort when they are very young, but they register the specific quality of adults who are working hard to present a version of themselves that is not entirely spontaneous. The register is not analytical. It is embodied, the slight extra tension in a room when certain subjects are approached, the quality of cheerfulness that has been produced rather than simply arising, the particular care with which certain emotional territories are navigated. Children map these territories without knowing they are mapping them, and the maps they produce shape how they move through the world long after the specific household that produced them is no longer their daily environment. William's map, assembled across the years in Kensington Palace and Highgrove and the other royal residences, included things that his conscious mind had not yet organized but that his experience had already stored. The phone calls and their pattern, the quality of his parents' interactions in the unmanaged moments between public appearances, the specific atmosphere of certain rooms at certain times, the texture of his mother's composure and what it cost her, visible to a child who loved her in the way that children see through the composure of the people they are closest to, without being able to articulate what they are seeing. He had also by 15 received more explicit information than the embodied map alone provided. Diana had been careful about what she said to her sons directly about the marriage and about Charles and Camilla. She was not the kind of mother who used her children as repositories for adult grievances. She understood, with the maternal intelligence that was among her most genuine qualities, that children should not be burdened with the full weight of their parents' private conflicts. She protected them from the most explicit versions of what she knew. But protection has limits. A 15-year-old who is paying attention to the world he lives in, who has access to newspapers and to the conversations of adults who are not always fully aware of what they are saying in his presence, who has a mother whose public account of her marriage has been the subject of a national conversation for the better part of 3 years, does not remain unaware of the broad outlines of what that conversation is about. William knew about Camilla, not in all the detail his mother knew, not with the specific evidence of the phone call and the years of accumulation that Diana carried, but in the way that a 15-year-old whose parents' marriage has been publicly acknowledged as having contained a third person knows, which is sufficiently. He knew the name and the history and the broad shape of what had happened, and he knew it in the specific context of a boy who loved his mother and had watched her absorb something for the entirety of his conscious life. Harry knew less explicitly but not less deeply. The emotional reality of the household had reached him through the channels available to a 12-year-old, through the atmosphere, through the specific quality of his mother's private moods that he experienced but could not fully contextualize, through the conversations that happened around him in ways that assumed he was not fully processing what he was hearing. He had absorbed something that he would spend years trying to organize into something he could understand. Diana's death interrupted both processes. It interrupted William's movement from absorbed knowledge toward analytical understanding at a point where the understanding was partial, complete enough to have shaped his relationship to the truth of his family's history, incomplete enough that significant parts of it remained unprocessed. And it interrupted Harry's movement from absorbed emotional reality toward conscious knowledge at a point where the emotional reality was deeply present and the conscious organizing framework was still being assembled. The interruption is irreversible. The conversations that would have happened between Diana and her sons as they grew older, the conversations in which she would have made her own decisions about what to tell them and when and in what form, did not happen. The specific account that Diana would have given her sons of her own life, shaped by her particular understanding of what they needed to know and when, was replaced by the available public record and by the institutional management of that record, which was in the hands of people whose interests were not identical to Diana's. The palace understood the significance of this replacement and managed it accordingly. Charles, in the years following Diana's death, had both the access and the institutional interest to shape how his sons understood their parents' marriage. He had the access because he was the surviving parent, the primary adult presence in their daily lives, the person whose account of events they would receive most immediately and most continuously. He had the institutional interest because the account of the marriage that served Charles's rehabilitation was not identical to the account that Diana had given in the Bashier interview and in the Morton book and in the other disclosures that had defined her public legacy. Charles did not, by the available accounts, conduct this management through explicit rewriting of Diana's account. He was not apparently the kind of father who sat his sons down and told them that their mother's version of events was wrong. The management was more institutional than personal. It operated through the palace apparatus, through the people who surrounded the boys and shaped their understanding of the world they were growing up in, through the gradual management of the narrative environment in which William and Harry developed their adult understanding of their family's history. The management had different effects on the two brothers. William, the older and the heir, was drawn more completely into the institutional framework. His education, his military service, his gradual assumption of public duties, all of it shaped by the palace's preparation of him for the role he would eventually occupy. That preparation required a specific relationship to the institutional history of his family, one in which the difficult chapters were acknowledged in the carefully managed way that institutions acknowledge difficult chapters, and then filed as history rather than as ongoing questions. William appears to have arrived, across the years of his 20s and 30s, at a version of his parents' history that he could live alongside the role the institution required him to occupy. What that version contains, what he understands about his mother's marriage and his father's relationship with Camilla and the institutional decisions that produced both, is not publicly known. He has not spoken about it in any substantive way. He has maintained on the subject of his parents' marriage and its private reality, the composure and the managed silence that the institution requires. The composure has been tested by the events of his own marriage, which this account has examined elsewhere. Whether the tests of his own situation have changed his understanding of his parents, whether the experience of being inside an institution that manages difficult truths has connected, for him, to the experience of watching his mother inside the same institution managing the same kind of truths, is not something the public record allows a confident answer to. What the public record does allow is the observation that William has maintained the silence on this subject with the thoroughness that the institution requires, and that the silence has been most thoroughly maintained on precisely the subjects where Diana's account and the institutional account diverge most significantly. Harry's trajectory was different, and the difference has become one of the most publicly visible facts of the contemporary royal family's story. Harry was 12 when his mother died. He was 26 when he met Meghan Markle. He was 35 when he and Meghan left the institution and moved to California. He was 37 when Spare was published. The arc of those years, from the 12-year-old who had absorbed his mother's emotional reality without yet having the framework to understand it, to the 37-year-old who had written a book about the institution and what it had done to the people inside it, is a story about the long, non-linear, frequently painful process of a person arriving at the understanding of things they were not fully conscious of having absorbed. Spare contains, in its account of Harry's relationship with his family and with the institution, the traces of what he absorbed in those childhood years and what he understood, through his own adult experience of the same institution, about what his mother had been dealing with. Not explicitly, Harry does not in the book provide a detailed analysis of his parents' marriage or of Diana's specific knowledge about Charles and Camilla, but the book's understanding of how the institution manages people, how it deploys the briefing operation, how it positions inconvenient individuals as problems to be managed rather than people to be cared for, how it maintains the surface at the expense of the individuals who pay for the surface's maintenance, is an understanding that resonates deeply with Diana's own account of what the institution had done to her. Harry learned it twice. He absorbed it first as a child, through the embodied experience of living inside his mother's household, watching her carry something he did not yet have the language to name. He learned it again as an adult, through his own experience inside the same institution, watching the same management techniques applied to his own wife, and finding in that experience a resonance with the earlier absorption that he had not previously been able to name. The naming, when it came, was the book. Spare is, among other things, a son's attempt to organize retrospectively what he absorbed from his mother's life, and what his own life confirmed about the accuracy of that absorption. The institution that Harry describes in Spare is recognizably the same institution that Diana described in the Morton recordings and the Bashier interview. The techniques are the same, the priorities are the same, the specific form of damage they produce in the individuals inside them is the same. Harry understood this connection. The book makes it explicit in places and implicit throughout. The chapter on his mother's death and its aftermath, the account of the palace's management of his grief and his access to information about what had happened, the description of what the institution required him to perform in the days after Diana died, all of it reads as the account of someone who has connected the absorption of childhood with the understanding of adulthood, and produced something that is both personal testimony and institutional analysis. The brothers arrived, through their different trajectories, at different relationships to the truth of their family's history. William arrived at a relationship shaped by the institutional framework and its requirements. Harry arrived at a relationship shaped by the double experience of absorption and repetition, The experience of having absorbed something in childhood and then having it confirmed by direct adult experience. Neither relationship is simple. Neither is complete. Both brothers carry versions of the truth of their family's history that are partial in ways they may not fully recognize, shaped by what they absorbed and what they were told, and what the institution managed for them to know and not know across the years since Diana died. What neither of them can change is the inheritance. The truth of what happened in the marriage, the phone call, the silence, the 15 years of managed knowing, the Bashir interview and what it revealed, is part of what they are. It shaped the household they grew up in. It shaped their mother's life and her death. It shapes in ways that express themselves differently in each of them, who they are and how they move through the world and what they understand about the institution they were born into. William will be king. He will carry the inheritance into the kingship, and the kingship will be shaped by it in ways that are not fully predictable from here. Whether the experience of his own marriage and the questions it has generated will connect, in his understanding of himself and his role, to the experience of watching his mother inside the same institution. Whether those two things will eventually produce a man who is different from the institution's management of him, or whether the management will hold, is one of the questions the future will answer. Harry has made his answer visible. He is in California. He has written the book. He has said publicly and with his name attached what the institution did and how it operated and what it cost the people inside it. The saying has cost him the institutional belonging that his brother retains, and the cost is real, and he appears to understand it as real. Whether the saying has given him something in exchange that the belonging did not, the specific freedom of someone who has set down a weight they have been carrying since childhood, the freedom of a person who has named a thing that lived unnamed in them for decades, is not something the public account can fully assess. What it can say is this: Diana's sons inherited what Diana knew, not in the same form she knew it, not with the same completeness, not through the same experience, but in the form that children inherit things from parents who carry them, through the atmosphere, through the absorption, through the specific texture of growing up inside a truth that was managed rather than spoken, and then spending the adult years working out what to do with what was absorbed. Diana had spent 15 years working out what to do with what she knew. She had done it with the resources available to her, the silence and then the careful disclosure and then the Bashier interview and then the book of a life that was preparing to continue, that had more saying left in it, that had not yet arrived at whatever the full account would have been. She did not arrive at the full account. The tunnel was the end of the account, in the middle of the telling. Her sons are the continuation of the telling, not as her proxies, not as the carriers of her specific grievances, as themselves. Men who absorbed what she was carrying and who are, each in their own way, working out what that absorption means for who they are and what they do with the inheritance. The inheritance is complicated and heavy and real. It is also, in the most fundamental sense, theirs. What they do with it is the remaining part of a story that Diana began with a phone call picked up in a room in Kensington Palace, and that is still in the lives of the two men she loved most, being written. The whisper cost Diana her marriage, her title, her place inside the institution she had entered as a 20-year-old who believed she was joining a family. It cost her more than that. It cost her the ordinary private life that the institution had promised, in its implicit way, to exchange for her public compliance. The bargain was never stated explicitly. No one sat Diana down and explained the terms. But the terms were understood, as the terms of these arrangements are always understood, by the people who had been inside the institution long enough to know how it worked. You perform the role, you maintain the image, you protect the surface. In exchange, the institution protects you. The institution did not protect Diana. It protected itself, using Diana as the material from which the protection was constructed. And when Diana ceased to be useful to the protection and became instead a threat to it, the institution deployed the same machinery against her that it had previously deployed on her behalf. The whisper cost Charles something more complicated to name. Not his marriage, which he had never invested in the way Diana had invested in it. Not his relationship with Camilla, which the marriage had failed to interrupt and which the marriage's end eventually freed to become what it had always been in private. What it cost Charles was the specific version of himself that the public image had been designed to protect. The reformed heir, the man who had learned from his parents' generation's failures, the future king who would lead a modernized, more honest monarchy. That version did not survive contact with the full account of what the marriage had actually been. The rehabilitation happened, and it was genuine in the sense that public sentiment genuinely shifted, but underneath the rehabilitation, in the public memory that outlasts managed narratives, the specific history of the marriage, the parallel relationship, the 15 years of sustained deception, the 3 people in a marriage and what that had meant for the one who had been sold a different version, remains part of how Charles is understood, part of the permanent record. The whisper cost Camilla the decades of public legitimacy that a straightforward life would have provided. The years of being managed out of the visible world, of existing in the officially deniable space between what everyone understood and what anyone could say, of being the woman named in a global television interview as the person who had occupied the marriage of the most famous couple in the world. Those years are not recoverable. The eventual formal recognition, the wedding in Windsor and the title and the coronation beside Charles as Queen Consort, came at the end of a road that was longer and more costly in personal terms than it needed to have been, shaped entirely by decisions that other people made and that she could influence but not control. The whisper cost the institution something it has not yet fully accounted for. The specific quality of uncritical public trust that makes the management operation work. The monarchy survives on a baseline of public willingness to extend the benefit of the doubt, to receive the managed image as substantially accurate, to interpret ambiguous information in the institution's favor, to engage with the performance of royal life as something that corresponds, roughly, to an underlying reality worth preserving. Diana's account of her marriage, delivered in her own voice to an audience of 23 million people who had spent 15 years forming their view of her as a credible witness, changed that baseline in ways that have not been fully reversed, not destroyed it. The institution continues, the monarchy continues, the coronation happened and the flags were waved and the public turned out in numbers sufficient to demonstrate that the relationship between the British public and its monarchy retains a vitality that the events of the previous 30 years had not extinguished, but changed. The specific quality of automatic deference, the willingness to accept the official account without asking what the official account is managing, has been replaced by something more conditional and more questioning. People who grew up watching the Wales marriage managed and then watching the management revealed are not the same public as the one that watched Charles and Diana's wedding in 1981 with the full uncritical warmth of people who had not yet been given reasons to ask what was behind the image. The whisper cost William and Harry their mother in the most direct sense, not the phone call itself, but the architecture of the marriage it revealed, and the institutional management of that architecture, and the years of Diana's life consumed by the carrying and the managing and the eventual speaking, and the final events of August 1997 that removed her from a life that had more of the speaking left in it. The cost to the brothers is ongoing. It is present in the specific ways that unresolved inheritance is always present, in the divergence of their paths, in the different relationships they have developed to the institution and its requirements, in the questions their own lives have generated that resonate, for anyone paying attention, with the questions their mother's life generated before them. The whisper cost the public something too. It cost them the specific comfort of the story they had been sold, the golden couple, the fairy tale marriage, the proof that the institution had learned from its own history and produced something better. That story was comforting in the way that stories about powerful people behaving well are comforting. It suggested that the world contained more integrity than daily experience sometimes implies. The loss of it, gradual and then complete, left a gap that no subsequent royal story has quite managed to fill. What it did not cost was the truth. The truth was the one thing the whisper produced and the management operation could not recover. It exists in the public record in Diana's own voice, permanent and unretractable, in the specific words of a woman who had spent 15 years preparing to say what she knew, and who said it clearly enough that no subsequent management could render it unsaid. The phone call happened. The marriage was what Diana said it was. The three people in it paid the costs that three people pay when an institution requires a specific arrangement and provides no honest accounting of what the arrangement will cost the people inside it. Those costs are documented. They are in the books and the recordings and the interviews and the testimony of the people who were present and who have, over the years, added their pieces to the picture. They are in the lives of two men in their 40s who are still, each in his own way, working out what to do with what they absorbed in the years before they were old enough to understand what they were absorbing. The whisper was one man's voice on a telephone, speaking to a woman who was not his wife, in a register of intimacy that made unmistakable what the relationship between them was. The woman who heard it was 20-something years old, and completely alone with what she heard. She was not alone forever. She found her way, through 15 years of patience and building and the careful accumulation of the public standing that gave her words their eventual weight, to a place where what she knew could be said. She said it. The institution has been managing the consequences ever since. It will continue managing them for as long as the institution continues, which is to say probably for a very long time. But management is not erasure. The whisper happened, the hearing happened, the 15 years of carrying happened. The 4 minutes and 17 seconds on a November evening in 1995 happened, in front of 23 million people who received what they heard as the truth and have not, in the decades since, been given sufficient reason to revise that reception. Some things survive the management operations mounted against them. Truth, when it is spoken by the right person at the right moment to an audience prepared to receive it, is one of those things. Diana knew that. She had been preparing to demonstrate it for 15 years. She demonstrated it. The demonstration is permanent. The rest is management. There is a specific kind of public forgiveness that is not quite forgiveness. It does not arise from the resolution of a grievance or the satisfaction of a demand for accountability. It arises from exhaustion, from the gradual wearing down of the energy required to maintain active negative feeling toward a person or a situation, combined with the availability of a narrative that makes accommodation more comfortable than continued resistance. It is the forgiveness of people who have decided, not always consciously, that the cost of continuing to object exceeds the benefit of the objection, and who have allowed the passage of time and the management of context to do the work that genuine resolution did not. Britain's eventual acceptance of Camilla as Queen Consort was that kind of forgiveness. It was real in its practical effect. She stands beside the king. She occupies the formal position. The polling that once showed large majorities of negative public sentiment has shifted to something more divided and more muted. The acceptance is genuine in the sense that it is operative, that it governs how the public and the press and the institution treat her in daily practice. What it is not is comprehensive. It does not include in any honest accounting a full reckoning with the specific history that required the forgiveness in the first place. The acceptance was purchased partly with time and partly with managed narrative and partly with the specific human tendency to let things go when letting go is made sufficiently easy and holding on is made sufficiently costly. It was not purchased with accountability because accountability was never offered. Understanding what Britain decided to accept requires understanding what it was asked to accept and when and through what process the asking happened. In August 1997, the week that Diana died, what Britain was being asked to accept was essentially impossible. The grief of that week, and it was genuine grief, not performed sentiment, not the manufactured emotional response of a manipulated public, but the specific sorrow of people who had received Diana as real across 15 years and who experienced her sudden removal as a personal loss, organized itself around the specific facts that were most available. The most available facts were the ones Diana had made available herself. The Bashir interview, the Morton book, the specific account she had given, in her own voice and with her own face and in the particular register of a person telling the truth at personal cost, of what her marriage had actually been. Those facts were the frame within which the public processed the death, and the frame was not one in which Camilla Parker Bowles appeared sympathetically. The polling conducted in the weeks after Diana's death showed public attitudes toward Camilla that were among the worst recorded against any figure associated with the royal family in the modern era. The specific character of the negativity was important. It was not the diffuse disapproval that attaches to abstract institutional failures. It was personal, and it was directed, and it was grounded in a specific understanding of a specific history. People who had watched the Bashier interview 2 years earlier and formed their judgment about what had happened in the Wales marriage were now processing that judgment in the context of Diana's death, and the processing was not producing charitable conclusions. The palace understood the depth of this feeling and the specific nature of its grounding, and the understanding shaped the management strategy for Camilla's rehabilitation with a patience that the institution's history of managing difficult situations had made available. The strategy's first requirement was time, not months, years. The palace was operating on a timescale that the media environment of the late 1990s made unusual and that required a sustained institutional commitment to a long-term outcome in preference to any short-term management of the immediate situation. Camilla was kept substantially out of the public eye. Not invisibly, she continued to exist in the social world, to appear at private events, to be photographed occasionally in contexts that were not officially royal. But the managed withdrawal from public prominence was thorough enough to allow the immediate post-Diana anger to begin its natural dissipation without being continuously refreshed by new occasions for negative response. The strategy's second requirement was the gradual recontextualization of the Charles and Camilla relationship within a narrative frame that was more sympathetic than the one Diana's account had established. This is the management operation's most delicate and most consequential work. Not the suppression of facts, which is legally and practically difficult in a democratic media environment, but the gradual reshaping of the context within which facts are received. The facts of the relationship were not changed. It had existed before the marriage to Diana, during it and after it. Charles had maintained it through circumstances that the available sympathy for Diana made it very difficult to frame sympathetically. The facts were what they were. What the management operation worked on was the surrounding context, the framing of Charles and Camilla as two people who had genuinely loved each other for decades, who had been denied the formal expression of that love by institutional requirements that neither of them had created, who had navigated an impossible situation as honorably as its impossibility allowed. This framing did not require the alteration of any fact. It required only the selective emphasis of certain facts and the careful management of the context in which other facts were received. The selective emphasis included the genuine duration and apparent depth of the relationship. It included the evidence of Charles's apparent happiness with Camilla in a way that the marriage to Diana had not produced, an argument implicit in the framing that people who are genuinely suited to each other had found their way to each other despite the institutional obstacles. It included the eventual evidence of Camilla herself as a human being rather than as a narrative function, the photographs and the occasional glimpsed moments that allowed the public to receive her as a person rather than as the abstract villain of the Wales marriage story. The management of the Diana-connected context required different skills. The challenge was not to deny Diana's account. That was not possible and would have been counterproductive. The challenge was to ensure that Diana's account was received over time in a context that allowed for the coexistence of its truth and the accommodation of Camilla that the institution required. This is a genuinely difficult management problem because the two things are in tension. Diana's account of the marriage, the three people, the sustained deception, the specific costs to herself, is not compatible in its full weight with the sympathetic framing of Charles and Camilla as thwarted lovers. One reading of the history makes the other reading difficult to sustain. The management operation resolved this tension not by choosing between the readings but by separating them in public consciousness. Diana's suffering was acknowledged. The institution had learned from the post-death reception that denying or minimizing her suffering was not viable. The acknowledgement was genuine in its expression even when it served institutional purposes in its timing and framing. Charles himself expressed regret in various formulations across the years, in terms that were sufficient to signal acknowledgement without constituting the full accountability that a direct and complete acknowledgement of what had happened would have required. Camilla's position was managed separately from the acknowledgement of Diana's suffering, not in the same conversations, not in the same framing, carefully kept in different compartments of the public discourse, so that the accommodation of one did not require the direct confrontation of the other. The management of compartmentalization, which had always been the institution's central skill, was applied here not to the private reality of a marriage but to the public reception of its history. The compartmentalization was imperfect. It is always imperfect. The people who refused to separate the two things, who insisted that accepting Camilla required engaging with what her presence in the marriage had meant for Diana, were not wrong. They were simply refusing the management operation's invitation to receive the two things separately. But they were, gradually and then more substantially, in the minority. The majority of the public, receiving the managed framing across years of careful presentation, arrived at the accommodation that the institution had been working toward, not the accommodation of people who had fully engaged with the history and arrived at a considered judgment, the accommodation of people who had been made sufficiently comfortable with the present to allow the past to recede into the category of difficult history that has been sufficiently acknowledged. The wedding in 2005 was the formal arrival at that accommodation. The subsequent years, in which Camilla occupied the role of Charles's wife with increasing public visibility and decreasing public hostility, confirmed that the management operation had achieved its central objective. The coronation in 2023 extended the achievement to its logical endpoint. Camilla, crowned as Queen Consort in Westminster Abbey, in the ceremony watched by a global audience, occupying the formal position at the center of the institution's public life. That moment was the culmination of 26 years of managed rehabilitation, from the nadir of August 1997 to the formal investiture of May 2023. The management operation had worked. By any operational measure, it had achieved what it set out to achieve. What it had not achieved, and what no management operation can achieve, was the rewriting of what had happened. The facts remained what they were. Diana's account remained in the public record, in her own voice, permanent and unretractable. The specific history of the marriage and of the parallel relationship and of what that combination had meant for the people inside it remained available to anyone who looked for it, in the books and the recordings and the testimony of the people who had been present. The acceptance Britain arrived at was acceptance of a present reality, Camilla as Queen Consort, Charles as King, the formal resolution of a history that had been managed toward this endpoint for decades. It was not acceptance of the history itself. That history has not been accepted in the sense of being fully engaged with and honestly reckoned with. It has been managed past, which is a different thing and which leaves the unresolved elements of it present in the background of everything the institution does. They are there now. In the background of the coronation and the public appearances and the managed image of a monarchy that has survived its most difficult chapter and is presenting itself as having emerged from the survival with something intact. Something is intact. The institution continues. The management operation continues. The surface holds. Underneath it, the history is what it is. Diana knew it first. She said it plainly. The institution has spent the years since managing the legacy of her saying it, with the skill and the resources and the long-term patience that are the institution's most reliable assets. The management continues. The history waits. The British monarchy has produced, across its long history, an enormous number of women whose names are not remembered. The wives who performed the institutional function and left no other mark. The mistresses who were managed into the background of official history and who exist now only in the footnotes of biographies of the men they loved. The daughters who were married into foreign dynasties and whose lives and deaths were recorded without the weight that the institution's history assigned to the men whose parallel lives form the official narrative. The servants and the ladies-in-waiting and the women who moved through the palace rooms and shaped the lives of the people inside them and left no trace in the record that the institution controlled. The institution forgets women efficiently. It is one of the things it has always done well, the management of which lives are remembered, and how the selective preservation of the record that serves the institutional narrative, the gradual disappearance from official history of the people who complicated the narrative without being central enough to require management of their memory. Diana is not one of those women. The institution did not forget Diana. It could not forget Diana, because Diana had made herself unforgettable in a way that the institution's management operation could contain during her lifetime and could not contain after her death. The public that received her as real, that had formed its own relationship with her across 15 years of public life, was not prepared to allow her to be managed out of their memory. and the institution understood this and adapted its management accordingly. The management of Diana's memory since 1997 has been among the most sophisticated operations the palace has conducted. It has required the institution to acknowledge her in ways that serve the institutional narrative, the charitable work, the connection with ordinary people, the mother's love for her sons, while managing the dimensions of her memory that complicate the narrative, the account of the marriage, the specific history of what the institution did to her, the questions about the circumstances of her death that have never been fully resolved to every interested party's satisfaction. The management has been largely successful. Diana's memory, in its dominant public form, is the memory the institution has shaped, the people's princess, the woman who changed the monarchy, the mother who died too young and whose death produced the most remarkable public outpouring of grief in modern British history. These things are true. They are also incomplete. The incomplete elements are the ones this account has attempted to address: the phone call, the 15 years of carried knowledge, the silent strategy and its costs, the Bashier interview and what it revealed about both the marriage and the woman who had survived it for long enough to speak, the specific character of what Diana knew and what she decided to do with knowing and what the doing cost her, and what it achieved. Those elements are part of Diana's story. They are not the comfortable part. They are the part that requires the institution to be seen clearly, in the specific way that Diana saw it, from the inside, with the direct experience of someone who had lived within its management and understood what the management was for and what it was willing to sacrifice to achieve its objectives. The institution would prefer a Diana whose legacy is the charitable work and the warmth and the mother's love, a Diana who changed the monarchy by humanizing it rather than by exposing it. A Diana whose memory can be incorporated into the institutional narrative as an enrichment of that narrative rather than a challenge to it. The Diana who exists in the full record is both of those things: the warmth and the exposure, the humanization and the challenge. The institution cannot fully manage the second without diminishing the first, and diminishing the first is not publicly viable given what Diana means to the people who remember her. The result is the specific kind of managed memory that the institution produces around the figures it cannot forget and cannot fully absorb, a memory that is real but curated, that acknowledges enough to prevent the accusation of erasure while not engaging fully enough with the uncomfortable parts to allow the uncomfortable parts to challenge the institutional narrative. Camilla exists in a different dimension of the institution's management of women. She is not forgotten. The coronation ensured that. She is not fully remembered in the sense of being fully engaged with as the person whose specific history the institution shaped. She occupies the formal position that decades of management produced, with the public's accommodation of her presence achieved through the process this account has described, and she moves through the public role with the particular composure of someone who has survived a very long road to arrive at a destination that once looked unreachable. What Camilla carries in her memory and in her private understanding of her own history is not available to the public record. She has not written the book. She has not given the interview. She has maintained across the entirety of the public controversy that her life produced a silence that is the most complete silence in this story, more complete than Diana's silence, which eventually broke, more complete than the institutional silence which has cracks running through it. Camilla's silence is the silence of someone who understands, with the comprehensive understanding of a person who has spent 50 years navigating the specific world she inhabits, that what she knows and what she says are two different things, and that the management of the distance between them is both the cost and the condition of the position she occupies. She will probably maintain it. The incentive structure that produces her silence is not weakening in the way that the incentive structures of other silences in this story have weakened. She is queen consort. She has arrived. The destination she has reached is the endpoint of the road, and the road behind her, however long and difficult, does not require revisiting. The women the institution forgets and the women it cannot. The distinction is not about worth or significance or the weight of what they carried. It is about the specific combination of visibility and stubbornness and public connection that makes some women impossible to manage into invisibility regardless of the institution's preference. Diana was that combination in its most complete form. Her visibility was total, the most photographed woman of her era, the face of a global public obsession. Her stubbornness was the specific stubbornness of someone who had absorbed what the institution required and then decided on her own schedule and in her own way that the absorption had reached its limit, and her public connection was the thing the institution had built and then failed to account for when it became a resource in her hands rather than a tool in its own. The institution built her into something it could not control, and then was surprised when it could not control her. The surprise suggests a failure of institutional imagination, the inability to anticipate that a woman who connects with people as directly and as genuinely as Diana connected with people might eventually use that connection in ways that served her interests rather than the institution's. The failure of institutional imagination is ongoing. The women who come after Diana, the women inside the institution now and the women who will enter it in the future, will be assessed through the same institutional framework that assessed Diana, with the same institutional priorities, and managed through the same institutional tools. The tools will be applied with the improvements that Diana's case generated: more careful management, more sophisticated surveillance of the public connection, more aggressive early management of narratives that threaten the institutional image. But the fundamental dynamic does not change. The institution requires women who will absorb what it needs them to absorb, perform what it needs them to perform, and maintain the silence that the performance requires. The women who do this completely are the ones it forgets. They perform their institutional function and leave no trace in the record beyond the function's performance. The women who cannot do this completely, who find the limit of what they can absorb and reach it visibly, are the ones it cannot forget. Because the reaching of the limit is itself the disruption that the institution's management exists to prevent, and the disruption that it cannot prevent is the disruption that defines the record. Diana reached the limit. She reached it in the specific way of someone who had been carrying something alone for 15 years and who had spent those years building the conditions under which the reaching of the limit would mean something. The meaning it produced is the legacy that the institution cannot fully manage and cannot forget. The phone call was the beginning of the reaching. The Bashier interview was the arrival at the limit. The 26 years since Diana's death have been the institution's management of what the reaching and the arriving produced. The management will continue. The institution will continue. The women inside it will continue to navigate the specific demands it makes and to reach each in their own time and in their own way, their own understanding of what those demands cost. Some of them will absorb the cost in silence and not be remembered. Some of them will reach the limit and be impossible to forget. Diana was the latter. She made herself impossible to forget not through the drama of her death, though the drama of her death amplified everything, but through the specific combination of 15 years of building and the 4 minutes and 17 seconds of a November evening in which she said in her own voice what her own experience had been. The voice is still there, in the recording, in the transcript, in the collective memory of the people who watched it and received it as true. Voices like that do not disappear because institutions prefer silence. They remain. They will always remain. The whisper Charles made to Camilla on a telephone in Kensington Palace, heard by a woman who had not been meant to hear it, produced a silence that lasted 15 years and a disclosure that has lasted 26 years and counting, and that will last as long as the record exists and as long as there are people to read it. The institution manages the present, the record owns the past. Diana understood this. It was perhaps the most important thing she understood about the world she had married into and the world she was preparing, across 15 years of silence, to speak to. She spoke. The record is hers. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.